many people approve of the rampage that took place at the Capitol, that's a very, very small number. I mean, overwhelmingly, public opinion, both liberal and conservative, the consensus is that that was a sorry spectacle that never should have taken place. So that's a point of actual unity in public opinion. Now, if you start to say, what, if anything, should be done to President Trump as a result of that, there you're going to get more of a division of opinion. I mean, clearly, most Democrats want to lay this directly at his feet and say that he should face, at a minimum, some sort of formal reprimand. Republicans are going to be much more divided on that question.
And when it comes to Republicans, particularly those in Congress, whether it's the House or the Senate, do you sense any significant shift when it comes to those who would back him as opposed to those who are now frankly tired of him?
Well, lots of people are frankly tired of him. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they want to vote to impeach him, but I think that Trump and his most ardent supporters did themselves a lot of damage with the events that took place at the Capitol, because now, even among people who had for years been fairly strong defenders of President Trump, there is a palpable sense that the Republican Party needs to move on and that we need to be looking at a post-Trump era of Republican politics. And I'm talking about people as close to the president as the vice president, as Mike Pence, as Lindsey Graham, as Mitch McConnell, the majority leader in the Senate. These are folks who clearly have had enough of the Trump show. And while they don't necessarily think that there should be impeachment again of President Trump, they are ready to move on to a less Trumpy future for their party.
That was Dr. Matthew Wilson of Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. Well, as the Trump administration enters its final days in office, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, has announced that the US is lifting its long-standing restrictions limiting the country's relationship with Taiwan. The State Department said they had originally been imposed decades ago to appease the mainland Chinese government, which lays claim to the island. But it said Taiwan was a vibrant democracy and a reliable US partner, and the restrictions were now null and void. So how has the news gone down in Taiwan? I've been speaking to Mark Ho from the ruling pro-independence DPP party and a member of Taiwan's legislature.
In Taiwan, we are really grateful for such a pleasant surprise of Secretary Pompeo. And of course, the Ambassador Kraft is coming over soon. That's the most friendly gesture for Trump administration to show their support for Taiwan.
This, though, is an American administration which is about to leave office. So in reality, what difference does it make?
I don't think this gesture will have any huge impact in the short run. But in the long run, I think Taiwan and US, we have mutual interest and we have the same value. After all, I think in every country, their foreign policy, it's not going to change at one click.
This move will surely antagonize China. Is it worth the risk?
China is always the same. I think this year, they're probably going to keep yelling at us, yelling at Taiwan. But from Chinese, their internal politics, they really have to do this. They have to show an attitude.
But it's more than yelling, isn't it? Or at least the risk is that it's more than yelling. I mean, China already flies military aircraft near Taiwan nearly every day. Does that not concern you?
It does increase our awareness. But I think right now during the pandemic issue, I don't think it's a good timing to overreact. I think it still have to link it to their internal politics. But in Taiwan, Japan, or Philippines, or Korea, South Korea, and we all are allied together. And then Taiwan and U.S. relation, we have our freedom to make friends with people we like.
I just wonder whether within Taiwan, I mean, you're obviously pleased about this move, but there will be people in Taiwan, because of the close historical connection between Taiwan and China and the close cultural connection between the two, there'll be people, perhaps older people, who are worried about this, surely.
If you said so, I have to frankly we have people really worry about it. But instead of being negative, instead of like being scaring the hell out of ourselves, we are actually quite prepared in terms of like our military budget is increasing. Taiwan is being friendly and then, making friends with the international world.
And just one final point. I mean, you discussed obviously the politics of America. There's about to be a new president. Do you anticipate a significant change in policy from Washington towards Taiwan under Joe Biden?
I think we share the same values with Biden. Biden is not Trump, but whatever Trump had been working on or he is trying to achieve, I think that foreign policy is shifting towards to the same direction, at least from Taiwan's perspective. And in the future, we wish to continue such a friendly gesture. We also hope we can work on various things together. And for example, this coronavirus, the pandemic, our president kept telling the world Taiwan can help. Maybe Taiwan isn't that powerful, but being there, we show our value, showing to people we can work together and having some contribution to the world.
Mark Ho, a legislator for the governing pro-independence DPP party in Taiwan, listening to him and to Matthew Wilson a moment ago, of course, my guest, Marcus Chow and Laleh Khalili. I suppose it invites the question about the future of American foreign policy and how much it might change under Joe Biden. Marcus Chow, how much do you think it will change? How much do you hope it will change?
Well, I think it will change a bit, but not entirely. I hope it will change a lot, obviously. I hope that Biden mends the relationships with with America's friends and allies, that he reestablishes links with NATO. But I think that it's going to be difficult to intervene internationally. There's no appetite in America, and we've seen what's happened in Syria, where Putin has filled the vacuum. So I hope that Putin will be discouraged from doing more things, but I can't see America changing to be interventionist, and I can see it remaining a bit isolationist as it has been under Trump.
Partly, I suppose, because there is the coronavirus out of control at home, and that has got to be any new president's priority, and Joe Biden has already indicated that that's definitely his priority.
I mean, that is a real priority because clearly the catastrophe that has hit America is really down to Donald Trump, who poo-pooed the disease, said it wasn't serious, and really has marshalled none of the resources of America to actually fight this disease. So I really hope that Biden devotes certainly the first few months of his presidency to trying to put that right, because it's catastrophic.
Laleh, on the broader foreign policy question, obviously you were talking about Iran in the run-up to the news. China now clearly rises again in people's minds in the light of what's just happened over Taiwan. That is a huge challenge for President-elect Biden.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that's interesting about this is, of course, that the US has always loved having a Cold War going because it helps the sort of the arms economy. It allows for the US to play the role of the good giant, even though they're not. But I think what is really worrying is that Trump administration knew that if they changed the facts on the ground, it would be very difficult for the Biden administration or any subsequent administration to walk it back. So that has been the case, for example, with the move of the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It has been the case with the nuclear agreement with Iran, and it has been also the case with all of the different policies that the U.S. has put in place to antagonize China. Everything from tariffs on goods, on the trade of goods, down to this very last-minute change in Taiwan policy. So the extent to which the Biden administration would want to actually walk these things back is also constrained by the fact that now things have changed. The world has moved on, and as you said, there's the COVID priority, and of course Biden himself being quite cautious and not a particularly bold thinker or mover. And so I think it is of great concern in a sense.
18 minutes past the hour. The Indonesian Navy says it's identified the location where a Boeing 737 aircraft crashed into the sea on Saturday, a few minutes after taking off from the capital Jakarta. 62 people were on board. The plane, operated by the budget carrier Sriwijaya Air, fell more than 3,000 metres in less than a minute before disappearing from radar screens. The BBC's Calistasia Wijaya told me what we know at this stage.
The officials have yet to find out or announce why the plane, the Sriwijaya plane, it lost signal less than 5 minutes after it took off from Soekarno-Hatta Airport in Jakarta. So they're still conducting the rescuing and searching in around Java Sea. And earlier today, we saw that a ship carrying civilians, divers, volunteers, they also participate in this operation. They are trying to calm the area where it is believed that the accident has happened yesterday. And also earlier today, the search and... Yes?
Tell us a little bit more about the plane and the airline.
Yes, so this is a Sriwijaya Air, which is the low-cost carrier in Indonesia. But as of now, it never had fatal accident. So it's considered to be one of the safest airline in Indonesia. So this accident is quite shocking to a lot of people here.
And the aircraft was a Boeing 737. We should stress this is a different model to the Boeing 737 MAX that crashed in Indonesia 2 years ago.
Yes, it's different, and it's 26-year-old, which some experts say that it's quite old, but until now we still do not know whether it has something to do with the accident. What we know so far is that the plane took off during a big rain yesterday, but still we still not conclude what's the cause of the why the airplane lost signal.
That was Kalastasia Wijaya speaking to me from Jakarta a little bit earlier on. It's 21 minutes past the hour. We're in the season for New Year resolution, so we're going to end the programme today with something for those of you who've resolved to learn a new skill in 2021. You could say the restrictions that many of us are under during the coronavirus pandemic may make this the perfect time for trying something new. But why can it be so hard to learn new skills in adult life? Well, the American journalist and author Tom Vanderbilt embarked on a year of learning purely for the sake of learning. He was compelled by his young daughter's insatiable curiosity and eagerness for new experiences. The result is a book just published called Beginners, The Curious Power of Lifelong Learning.
I was trying to play a game of checkers, what you call drafts, with my daughter, who was 4 at the time, and she saw a chessboard nearby and asked if we could play a simple game of chess. And I said that would be great, except I actually don't know how to play chess. I had tried to learn when I was a kid, and it just never stuck. So I was suddenly faced with this idea of trying to teach her something I didn't know how to do myself, a beginner trying to teach a beginner, which I thought was a terrible idea. So I tried to learn the beginnings, but then I found I was in over my head, and I had to hire a coach. So as this coach came in and started teaching her, I thought, well, why should I sit on the sidelines and just have her learn something? Why don't I learn at the same time? So there were 2 beginners, 1 40-something, trying to learn the same thing at the same time.
Just out of interest, which one of you learnt it more quickly?
This is an interesting question because we all think we know about how children are such amazing learners, and they really are. Their brains have many more synapses, neural connections that are being formed. An adult has a lot of stuff they've already learned, which tends to get in the way of learning new things. But that's not the whole story. I mean, my daughter was putting a lot more time into this because she has more time. And she was doing things with her coach that I simply wasn't doing. She was analyzing the games she played and lost very carefully, where I was just playing a lot of online chess against people, hoping to get better through sheer repetition, which is really not the way to do this. So the end of the story is that she can beat me, usually pretty handily.
Nevertheless, it's a new skill for you, and you went through the process of learning that new skill. So where did you take that experience from there?
Learning chess just brought home this realization that I hadn't really been learning that many new skills. As a journalist, I was always absorbing new information, but the idea of a skill, I think I was prohibited from doing that by a sense of fear. Why would I want to take up something and be bad at it in my 40s and now 50s when I could just sort of coast along on the things I was already good at? So I sort of thought about the things I'd always wanted to take a crack at: drawing, singing, surfing, that had sort of haunted me my whole life, and thinking that it was too late to get to these things. And I thought, well, you know what? It's not too late. I still have the capacity. I just have to get over this fear. So I just opened myself up to this whole new world of basically being bad at things and found it incredibly exhilarating and rewarding.
Let's break them down. How was drawing, first of all?
Drawing, this is a thing that I think we all do as children. Children are sketching all the time, making little drawings, and it's even taught early on in school and encouraged. And then at some point, it begins to fall out of the curriculum, and the kids who are thought to be better than the others are sort of shifted in one direction. They become the art kids. Everyone else is sort of thought you're not artistic, leave this behind. And we basically lose the skill. So when I started to try to draw again, in my late 40s, my first teacher said, you're drawing kind of like an 8-year-old, the 8-year-old that you were, because I simply hadn't worked that muscle. And I just would like to put this point across to listeners that things like drawing and singing, we get hung up on the idea of them as these God-given innate gifts that people just sort of magically have. And what my drawing teacher in particular, was saying, drawing is not this God-given thing. It's a motor skill. It's just something you need to look at the world in a new way. And everyone can manipulate a pencil. That's not really the hard part. It's just changing the way you see the world. And that is really the hurdle for a lot of people. That and the notion that, well, you're too old, you can't be an artist, et cetera, et cetera.
Two thoughts come to mind. One is that sort of notion, and you touched on this a moment ago, this idea of the fear of failure. What will other people think when we try and do something that we're not very good at? But also that idea that as we get older, it's important for us to keep our brains exercised and active. How much are those two factors at play here, do you think?
Oh, they're immense. And I should just note that anyone embarking on a learning journey at really any age should just anticipate failure, and a lot of failure. I spent some time watching infants with some researchers at NYU, infants that were trying to learn to walk. And the failure rate of infants trying to walk is astonishing. And this has been filmed and tracked. They will fall anywhere from 30 to 40, even 70 times per hour as they are trying to walk. And luckily their bodies are sort of engineered to handle these falls very well. But if any of us walked into, let's say, a surf class and fell 40 times in the first hour, I think we would walk out of there feeling pretty discouraged. But the good news is that in the beginning, the so-called learning curve is very steep. And that's actually a positive thing. The learning curve just refers to progress versus time. A lot of us sort of get that notion wrong, but you can achieve a lot in the early stages of a skill. I mean, learning to juggle 3 balls, for example, is not immensely difficult, but go into a room of 30 people and ask how many people can do that. Odds are not that many people. So you can unlock a huge amount of accomplishment without much effort. And just in terms of yes, the aging brain, I mean, the brain is a novelty-seeking machine. We really don't stop wanting to learn until we die. And I think the evidence is out there that learning as we get older, and particularly learning with other people, there seems to be sort of a social magic or sort of chemistry that is unlocked there, that it's both a more effective way to learn, but also brings in that social element, which has all sorts of positive benefits.
Tom Vanderbilt, his book, Beginners, The Curious Power of Lifelong Learning. It strikes me in the last couple of minutes of the programme that spending the last 2 hours, Lale, with you and Marcus, neither of you stopped learning at any point, by the sounds of it, Lale. I mean, your appetite for it is as strong as ever.
I absolutely love being constantly a student. It's exciting. It's wonderful. And my mother, after she retired at the age of 75, took up interpretation of Sufi poetry, took up yoga, took up painting, and she's flourishing at all of them. She's now 81. It's brilliant.
And Marcus, any truth in this notion that as we get older, it's harder to learn something new?
I don't think it is, actually. I remember some research a few years ago about language learning. And we all think that adults are worse at learning languages than children, but in fact that isn't true. It's simply that children have vast amounts of time without any distractions, whereas adults have to pay their gas bills, have to worry about so many other things. Put in the same number of hours, and as Vanderbilt mentions, be prepared to fail repeatedly, and you could do the same as a child.
On that note, thank you both very much for being a part of the programme today. My guests throughout, Lale Khalili and Marcus Chown. Thank you as well for listening to this edition of Weekend. The programme back at the same time next Saturday, of course. In the meantime, have a good week, and the news is coming up next.
You're listening to the BBC World Service.
Every hour, we bring you the latest news headlines.
Events around the world as they happen.
With further in-depth analysis throughout the day.
If the political will exists, then I think it can be done.
We've been across so many lines in the sand that I think we're almost out of the desert.
From our presenters and reporters.
I just think we need to kind of stop it and recognise the significance of the moment.
Based all around the world.
As our North America correspondent reports.
The latest from Johannesburg.
Our Middle East editor has more details.
More from our correspondent in Sydney.
And we tell the stories of the people at the heart of the headlines.
I saw so many injustices. Nobody helped. Everybody's scared. This is crazy.
You've got to wonder what the motivation is. Are people running away from something, wanting to hide from something?
I don't care where the chips fall. I'm going to speak the truth, say it like it is, no matter what.
It's a fight for my land. It's a fight for my people.
The BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello, I'm Anand Jagatia, and after the news I'll be here with Crowd Science, where we're asking, can green spaces make us healthier? For many of us, being outdoors in nature is calming and relaxing, but are the plants themselves impacting our health? And if so, how? We speak to plant experts about the power of green and also head to Milan to hear how a large urban city is transforming itself with more natural spaces. That's Crowd Science on the BBC World Service next.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. The outgoing US Vice President Mike Pence will attend Joe Biden's inauguration in 10 days' time. Donald Trump has said he will not attend the ceremony, breaking tradition. Democrats in Congress plan to start impeachment proceedings against President Trump on Monday, following the storming of the Capitol building by his supporters. The social media app Parler has accused major technology firms of staging a coordinated attack on free speech after Amazon became the latest to take action against it. Parler's chief executive said the app might be unavailable for up to a week as it tried to rebuild from scratch. Taiwan has welcomed a decision by the United States to lift long-standing restrictions on official contacts between them. The State Department said the previous rules had been imposed decades ago to appease China, which claims the territory. The Indonesian Navy has recovered wreckage from the sea off the coast near Jakarta, where a Boeing 737 aircraft crashed on Saturday shortly after takeoff. 62 people were on board. The cause of the crash remains unclear. The Prime Minister of Japan, Yoshihide Suga, has said it will be a few days before the government can decide if measures to tackle a surge in COVID-19 cases in and around Tokyo needs to be extended. Regional governors have asked for the state of emergency to be extended to their prefectures. People in Kyrgyzstan are going to the polls to elect a new president and vote in a referendum on how they are governed. The polls are being held 3 months after unrest led to the release from jail of the current frontrunner in the presidential race, Sadir Japarov. And voters in the Central Asian Republic of Kazakhstan are casting their ballots in parliamentary and municipal elections, the first under President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. BBC News.
Oh, wow. It's hard to miss, isn't it? I don't think I've ever seen anything like that. Picture this. You're in Milan, the fashion and financial capital of Italy, driving through the business district, and suddenly you see a forest. That is crazy. There are hundreds of trees, some of them ripe with fruit, thousands of shrubs, countless flowers, and even some wildlife. But the thing that makes this forest spectacular is that it rises up out of the ground over 100 metres into the air, because it's growing all over the sides of 2 residential tower blocks. This is Bosco Verticale, Milan's vertical forest. Can you imagine how different cities would look if all skyscrapers looked like that? All tall buildings just were covered in plants. You're listening to Crowd Science from the BBC World Service. I'm Anand Jagatia, and we're here in Italy to visit this amazing building because we want to find out how green spaces can affect our lives and our health. It's all thanks to a question from one of our listeners. She lives a 2-hour train ride away in a small village that couldn't be more different from the hectic metropolis of Milan.
Hi, I'm Enrica Dincalci from Torre di Quartesolo in Italy. My question for crowd science is, do green spaces make us healthier? I love to stop here or to stop in these kind of places and observe the landscape. It's like stopping the time, freezing the moment, and I can enjoy it for the rest of the day, in my memory, of course.
So do you come here quite often then?
Yeah, well, almost every day, yeah. Yeah, it's like a recovery.
By day, Enrica is an art teacher, and like many of us, she finds it relaxing to be outdoors in green spaces. This riverbank is a way for her to unwind after a hard day's work. But aside from making us feel less stressed, are there other measurable health benefits to being in nature? We'll be returning to Italy very soon, but first we need to speak to someone who can tell us more about how exactly green environments might impact our health. And it's trickier than you might think. Even though landscapes like Enrica's riverbank are calm and serene, there's still a lot for our senses to take in. Different colours, shapes, sounds of water, birds, insects, and the smells and aromas coming from the plants and the river. Plus, there's the fact that you're actually outdoors, getting fresh air, sunshine, and some exercise. Teasing out the potential health benefits of all these things isn't easy. Natural spaces are wild and messy, very unlike an ordered laboratory where everything can be controlled and measured. Nevertheless, this is a field of research that's absolutely booming right now, and to help us make sense of it is Professor Cathy Willis.
I'm Professor Cathy Willis. I'm the principal of St Eben Hall at the University of Oxford. I'm also a professor in biodiversity here in Oxford.
Cathy is also former Director of Science at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew in the UK. She's also currently writing a book about green health. So what does the research tell us about green spaces? Might they improve our health?
Increasingly, the evidence that's coming through is suggested is the plants themselves that have these very, very positive benefits for physical and mental well-being. And there was a study about 10 years ago, a very interesting study, that looked at recovery rates in hospitals when people looked out of a window. And if they looked out of a window onto another brick wall, their recovery rates were one level. If they looked out onto trees, 3 times faster by looking out onto vegetation.
Really? And that's controlling for the fact that hospitals that have nice views might be better equipped,
Yes.
And that sort of thing?
So throwing all statistics known to humankind, they still found this same finding. There's more and more work that's been gone on using these massive biobank data sets, which are effectively, millions of people, all their medical records, put into these biobank data sets, and you know where the people live. They're geolocated. And because they're geolocated, you can then link the people to the environmental variables of where they live. And a very nice study carried out and published last year in one of our top medical journals, The Lancet, showed that those people that lived in greener areas had much better mental well-being outcomes.
This certainly sounds intriguing, like perhaps our health is intertwined with the health of the plants around us. But hang on a minute, surely people living near to nice green spaces, I'm thinking tree-lined boulevards and golf courses, are going to be wealthier, and so they'll have better access to education and healthcare. Can we separate those factors out?
A huge amount of work's been done by the statisticians on this very point, because it can't just be that actually you're wealthier, therefore you're able to have plants. And taking away all of those additional variables, it still has a very strong signal. But interestingly, the impact of green is greater on people of a lower socioeconomic status, and on women, and on people less than 60 years in age. So those 3 factors, if we are going to improve our cities of the future, those 3 themselves suggest these could have really, really significant outcomes for those groups.
It seems like listener Enrica is onto something. Green spaces do seem to do us some good. But how exactly do they have this positive effect on us?
Gradually, more and more work is being done by the medical sciences to look at your psychological and physiological responses to different aspects of vegetation. And colour is a really important one. So when they wired up the brain to effectively look at actually responses within the brain and the blood flow to the brain, which is a very good way of looking at your emotional response and also then how that affects your blood pressure and your general well-being, they found that when people look at green and white colours of leaves, they were more relaxed, they were happier, and their blood pressure was lower. When they look at red colours, actually that does often invoke anger, which does make you wonder about having poinsettias, those red plants on your table at Christmas time, and why there are so many rows at Christmas time. So colour is a really important one, but it's more than just colour. There was another nice study where they looked at pansies, and they got a group of students and they measured their blood pressure, and they showed them pansies, yellow pansies, their blood pressure got lower and they were happier. When they showed them the same, a box of pansies, but they didn't tell them they were polyester, those sort of cloth type pansies.
Fake ones.
They had no reaction.
So they actually has to be a real, even though they couldn't tell.
Even though they couldn't tell. So then it leads on to, okay, what are those other factors in plants that might evoke and lead to physiological and psychological benefits? And so another one that's a really interesting one is to do with smell. If you walk across grassland, a freshly cut, mown lawn, there is a fantastic smell, isn't there? You sort of breathe that in and always feel really good at that smell.
I mean, what happens when I do that is I immediately start sneezing. So
there are
yes.
good and bad smells. But certainly some trees, or some plants, but particularly trees, have these organic volatile compounds that they emit. And they emit them for different reasons, and attracting insects or as a defence mechanism. But some of those smells are really, really important for our physical and mental well-being. And one of the most interesting ones is the Japanese cypress, the hinoki cypress. And there was a lovely study done where they had 30 individuals who were in hotel rooms for 3 nights, and they diffused this oil in the bedrooms in the air. And they measured their blood pressure, they measured their urine, and they measured their blood. And after the 3rd night, they had a statistically significant decrease in the adrenaline hormone, so sort of calmer. They had lower blood pressure, but also they had a really big increase in natural killer cells in their blood. Now, natural killer cells are the ones that attack viruses and also attack cancer.
I think this is fascinating that the colour green itself might be soothing to us, and that some plants like hinoki emit a cloud of health-promoting chemicals. But what if the landscape that you live in doesn't have hinoki trees in it? Or what if it isn't even green? What if you go walking in beautiful mountains where the landscape is more brown or grey?
The work just hasn't been done. When you look at the number of species that have been investigated, because the question really ought to be what plants and where. And we just don't know. If I added up the number of species that I know people have done this sort of work on, it's probably 100, 150. We currently know there are 420,000 species of vascular plants. So it's a massive area of research, but it can have a huge impact going forwards, because this is what we need. If we're going to design our cities and our landscapes for the future, the outcomes that you get, the mental and physical well-being outcomes, are often, this is why the medics are so interested, they're often more powerful than taking drugs.
Really?
Yes. This is why this is such a great listener question.
You're listening to Crowd Science from the BBC World Service, and today we're answering listener Enrica's question, do green spaces make us healthier? So far we've heard that there is something about plants themselves that seems to be good for our physical and mental health, although Kathy Willis points out that the research has only just scratched the surface. Given that more and more of us are moving away from green spaces and into built-up cities, should we be bringing more of the natural world into our urban areas? By 2030, an estimated 60% of us will live in cities, and a third of us will live in cities with a population of over 1 million. And that will take its toll on our bodies and our brains. More air pollution, noise pollution and traffic, less opportunity for physical exercise, and fewer of the natural landscapes that we evolved in. So could more green or natural spaces help? And if so, how are we going to go about including them? Let's head back to Milan, a city that's currently grappling with this question. Home to 2 world-famous soccer clubs and part of Italy's industrial heartland, for decades Milan has been more about fashion, factories and football than green spaces and clean air. So how is it possible to add more green to a city like Milan, where space is already at a premium? Well, one way is to plant vertically upwards rather than your usual horizontal park or garden. That's exactly what they've done here at Bosco Verticale, literally translated as the vertical forest. Trees and shrubs have been planted so that they completely cover the surface of a block of flats. If you want to see just how spectacular this place looks, we've made a video that will be online soon. Head to this week's programme page at bbcworldservice.com/crowdscience to watch it. And if you haven't already, do subscribe to our podcast whilst you're there, as we've answered a lot of questions about how city life is changing, from how we can fight unwanted noise to whether all cars could be electric.
Buongiorno.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Anand.
Simona.
Pleasure.
Accomodatevi, prego.
Prego.
Super nice.
Wow. On the inside, Bosco Verticale is almost as impressive as on the outside. These two tower blocks house 21,000 plants, along with the people who live here too. Simona was the very first person to move into the vertical forest, and needless to say, I am incredibly envious of her stunning apartment. Unlike my sad collection of dying pot plants, Simona's balcony has actual pomegranates growing on it. We step outside and I ask her what it's like to live somewhere like this.
I feel privileged living here because I'm surrounded 24 hours by plants and trees. Living inside the green, for sure, it's a good thing. Everybody cannot live in the countryside since it's fascinating, but at the same time, like the city offers you a lot of services and infrastructures and so many things that we decided to live in the city. But for sure, the presence of the green, the flowers, the plants and the trees, they're making our psychological condition like much better, and according to this, also the physical health.
Psicologico e in conseguenza anche fisico.
So the residents of Bosco Verticale feel like the forest is good for them. But is there any research on just how the plants have impacted the local environment or people's lives here? Laura Gatti is one of the two co-designers of the project. She's a landscape consultant and her business is trees. Although actually she says that for the past 25 years, they've been her mission.
I started to be involved in projects in which the greening is integrated to the building, giving the opportunity to people to approach nature every single moment of their life, not just during weekend or vacation, but every day.
When people maybe think of a landscaper who works with trees, they probably think of the trees being flat and horizontal, not vertical up in the air. So just looking at this building and the one surrounding it, it's incredible just how many trees there are on the sides of the building. In terms of the effect or the impact that the project has had, so it's been around for 7 years now, do you have any data on how the plants have impacted the local microenvironment or the local climate, or how they've impacted people that are living in the buildings?
From the point of view of the climate, what we measured is that the temperature on the facade of a building, it could be 35 degrees lower. If it's in full sun, you could measure 65 degrees. And if you move just 1 meter and you move under the shadow of your trees, you could realize that the temperature of the facade is dropping.
That is so up to 35 degrees cooler.
Yes.
That is centigrade or Fahrenheit?
Centigrade.
Centigrade. That's incredible.
Yes. You can imagine all this heat is not coming back to the air during the night.
So it helps to keep the city a bit cooler.
It helps to keep the city cooler.
This sounds promising, although of course in tree and building life cycle terms it is early days. I'd be interested to see more published research about this project as it matures further. There do seem to be other environmental bonuses to Bosco Verticale too, as architect and second co-designer Stefano Boeri told me.
People here doesn't use conditioned air in summertime.
Really?
That means that's an amazing contribution to reduce the cost of energy consumption. And then again we have several species of birds that are nesting here. So I like very much also this idea of a kind of epicenter of biodiversity in the center of a very dense and polluted city. So, well, I think it's a statement. Definitely. It's possible to do this, it's possible to do better, let's do it.
Yeah, so speaking of let's do it, I mean, are there plans to build more vertical forests in Milan and also elsewhere in the world?
It is true, we are now working in many different countries. We are working in China, we are developing several vertical forests and also a small forest city in China. We are working.
Forest city?
Yeah.
So how many buildings would that?
What's basically it's a city for 30,000 people in China. Another one we are going to build in Cancun, Mexico. Is that one for 100,000 people, and then we have also required to do that in Egypt.
Stefano's vision is both about retrofitting existing cities and building entire new ones with trees and plants integrated from the start, which could improve air quality and lower temperatures, both important factors for our health. And more buildings like this in different locations using a range of local plant species will provide more data for researchers to assess just how helpful they might be. But Bosco Verticale is a first, a statement venture with a price tag to match. Could these kinds of projects ever really be affordable enough for most people to benefit from?
The cost of the building was mirroring a little bit this first research phase. Now, what we are doing, just to give you an example, in Eindhoven, we are used prefabrication. We have used new model of maintenance. So it's a building for everybody, low cost. In China, we are building many buildings in such a house. So I absolutely believe that this statement could become a popular statement.
And aside from planting trees on buildings, Stefano's also involved in a project to get them on the ground. The other big idea in Milan is to plant 3 million trees in the city by 2030.
Basically, is for every person 1 tree in 10 years. Not so much, no, it's not so much. So it's possible, and it will cut drastically the pollution here of Milano. It will also reduce 2/3 the CO2 produced by the city, so it will be amazing.
To help bring this grand green plan to life, he'll be working with the Deputy Mayor for Urban Planning.
In the next decade, Milan will have 20 new parks in the inner city.
Pier Francesco Moran was born in Milan and he's now a city councillor in charge of green areas and urban planning. I met him at a building site, but it's probably the most picturesque building site I've ever been to. City Life is a vast modern office and living space, combining everything from children's playgrounds and fountains to parks and skyscrapers. It's the kind of place that Milanese residents have only recently started to expect.
In the 80s, in the 90s, we said that something that makes Milan special was the fact that it was 1 hour far from the sea and 1 hour far from the mountain. So people go away during the weekend and they don't expect quality of life inside the city. Actually, something has changed, luckily. So the people expect to have quality inside the city. They expect to have green areas for themselves, for their kids. And so these new parks are part of this strategy, and I would say also the testimonial for the new areas that we are imagining.
It's not surprising that people in cities like Milan want a cleaner, more pleasant and a healthier environment to live in. But projects like City Life don't come cheap. How do Milan city planners know if they're investing wisely and in the best possible way for people's health? Time to meet our last expert here in Milan.
We came from different countries and we have a real different background.
Maddalena Buffoli is a researcher in public health, urban health, climate change and city resilience at Politecnico di Milano. She contributed to a World Health Organization report about urban green space interventions and health. It was made with a whole bunch of experts from cities all over Europe, where people have different priorities and problems, as Maddalena found out.
For example, I try to explain that in Italy, during summer, so many people go to the park to take some fresh air, because only if you live in Italy or Greece or Spain, you can understand this effect is very important, because now we have so much death during the hotmost days of summer. This is just an example.
Yeah, and so more green spaces might potentially be able to help reduce those deaths.
Yes, a lot, because Here we have got a lot of people, especially old people, that haven't air condition. There are some days that the temperature here is 40 degrees. And coming to the green area, the temperature is 5, 8, maybe in some days also more centigrade less.
Wow.
So, yes,
Can make a big
it's
difference.
fantastic for us.
So access to green spaces could literally be the difference between life and death for some people living in cities. It's hard to think of a more dramatic impact on our health. But what about some of the other benefits that parks and green areas could have?
We have several benefits. Some of them are certain and some of them are more uncertain. We know at first that we have got improved outdoor air quality, and this reduction of environment pollution can have a direct impact on non-communicable disease. By the other hand, the green spaces favor physical activity, and this is also another very important effect, because in the city we know that there is a big percent of people that don't make physical activity daily. So we have some efforts that are important, but we have to quantify how we can improve this physical activity.
Can you summarise then, I know this is quite a big report, but can you kind of summarise what you found were some of the most effective urban green interventions?
Project that involve people at the beginning of the project have more benefit on health. So involving people, I think that is the first things that we have to do when we want to approach a new urban green project. Then the new park, urban park, obviously are the best solution.
So urban parks in cities like Milan have a lot of potential. They could cool the city and reduce heat deaths, lower pollution, and lead to people doing more exercise. But of course, that's only going to happen if they're thoughtfully designed in the first place for the needs of residents. We started this show with Enrica's question, can green spaces make us healthier? And we've heard from all the experts that they are good for us physically and mentally. There's still a lot of research to be done to work out how exactly plants have this wonderful effect on us, through their colours and smells, and maybe even through their shapes and sounds. But given the potentially huge benefits, it seems like Milan's approach, for plants to take root throughout the city, does make sense for those of us who aren't lucky enough to live out in the countryside. Whether that's building more parks or planting more trees, it's exciting to think that maybe the urban jungles of the future will look a lot different to the urban jungles of today. Before we leave Italy, we've got time for one last drink with our listener Enrica. We're sitting by the canal in the centre of Milan, and Enrica, you've come out to join us. Thank you so much. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. I had a good trip to Milan. It was nice to see you again and have a chat.
Yeah, and it's definitely very different atmosphere here to the peaceful countryside that we were walking around in Vicenza.
Definitely, this is really very alive.
What did Enrica make of our answer to her question, and of Milan's quest to build lots more green spaces?
This should be a time when cities and governors turn their way to see people's lives, not just as productive, but as enjoying life and making their lives better, not just their incomes.
Well, look, brilliant. Thank you so much for inviting us to Italy and showing us around, and for your amazing question. Are you happy with the answers that we've dug up?
Yeah, I'm happy. I'm definitely happy. It's just, when you understand that the feeling that you feel are shared from many people, you kind of feel in a huge community, and you feel like you're just the same humankind, and the bond with nature is not going rotten, it's just increasing. That's it for this edition of Crowd Science from the BBC World Service. Today's question was from me, Enrica, in Italy. The program was presented by Anand Jagatia and produced by Jen Winty. If you have a question that science might be able to answer, please send it to crowdscience@bbc.co.uk. Thanks for listening. Ciao!
This is the BBC World Service, and here's what World Book Club have been reading.
I'm Harriet Gilbert, and we've been reading a novel published 7 years ago, a story of love and cinema set during the 1918 flu pandemic.
It was one of those rare moments in history where everything seems to happen at the same time.
The book's called Moonstone, The Boy Who Never Was, by the Icelandic author Sjón.
World Book Club at bbcworldservice.com/World Book Club. And in half an hour, Outlook Weekend with Anu Anand.
When Jesse Thistle lost touch with his Indigenous mother in childhood, it set him on a path to drug addiction, homelessness and prison. But love is strong. Today he's not only an expert in Indigenous history, he does his fieldwork with his mom by his side.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
On From Our Own correspondent after this bulletin, Seoul
teleprompter Trump had spoken. It was perhaps enough to head off calls for the president's resignation or removal by his cabinet or impeachment by Congress. But as we've seen time and time again, unscripted Trump has a habit of re-emerging before long, and we are still days away from Joe Biden's inauguration on the 20th of January. Long stretches of silence punctuated by videos or tweets have actually been standard fare for journalists at the White House since November's election. The president's once packed public schedule has been reduced to almost nothing. The daily guidance we get from the White House at this point only says he will work from early in the morning until late in the evening. He will make many calls and have many meetings. The times I've been at the White House recently have been exercises in monotony. This week, of course, was different. The president had for some time been pointing to the 6th of January as a day of reckoning when his supporters would descend on the nation's capital and register their outrage. I've covered U.S. politics for decades. I've walked those same marble hallways of Congress where rioters, clad in military gear and waving Confederate flags, ran wild. So the images of chaos in the Citadel of Liberty, as Joe Biden called it on Wednesday, have been particularly staggering. We Americans like to hold ourselves and our democracy up as an example to the world. President Ronald Reagan in the 1980s called America a shining city on a hill, drawing from the words of the nation's early Puritan settlers. The term American exceptionalism has been frequently employed in recent years, a way of suggesting that the United States is somehow unique and special, a model for others to follow. On Wednesday, the example, the model America set was far from exceptional. It was a warning to other nations of what can happen when darker passions run amok. It was a reminder that even citadels of liberty can fall.
That was Anthony Zerka. On the 14th of January, Ugandans will vote in presidential elections. This will be the incumbent Yoweri Museveni's 6th election since coming to power in the mid-80s. Over the years, he's seen off many opponents and sidestepped several crises. This time around, though, his main challenger really knows how to mobilise a crowd. 38-year-old Bobi Wine is a charismatic musician whose songs seem to speak especially to young Ugandans. People aged 18 to 29 make up 44% of registered voters in Uganda, according to the Electoral Commission. Our Africa correspondent, Catherine Byaruhanga, asks, behind the popular chorus, what are the political notes to his movement?
On Christmas Eve, presidential candidate Robert Chagulanyi, popularly known as Bobi Wine, brought his campaign to his family's ancestral home. He arrived in Gombe district in rural central Uganda, dressed as he often is now, in a bulletproof vest and protective helmet. Soon, he and hundreds of his supporters who crowded around his white Toyota Land Cruiser were in a standoff with police officers and soldiers. His rallies have been broken up with tear gas, live ammunition and water cannon countless times now. The government says it's just trying to make sure campaign events observe COVID-19 guidelines on social distancing. In December, Bobi Wine's Land Cruiser was shot at. One bullet went through the windscreen, narrowly missing a passenger. But in Gombe, not many candidates have a musical canon they can draw on in tense confrontations like these. Bobi Wine's song Afande blasted from car speakers. Afande means boss in Swahili and is used to refer to security officers. The candidate and his supporters sang out together, "Before you hurt me, listen to my cry. The problems I am passing through are the same as yours. I am fighting for you and for me." It wasn't long before thick white clouds of tear gas appeared and bullets were fired. But Bobi Wine's convoy was allowed into a school playground. Speaking there, he had a warning for the security forces and the government. The same way you captured us and imposed yourselves on us is the same way you will leave. 35 years ago, there was another young, charismatic politician drawing crowds in Uganda. Yoweri Museveni was first sworn in as president on the 29th of January 1986. But it was not a conventional ceremony. The slim, chubby-faced man of the moment was dressed in military fatigues. His rebel army, many of them child soldiers, stood guard. They had just won a 5-year bush war and grabbed power in the chaotic aftermath. Back then, Museveni famously promised a fundamental change to the politics of Uganda. He has won 5 elections since then, but most have been marred by accusations of rigging and violence against the opposition. His rebel army has become the National Army, and now he's accused of using it to stay in office. Museveni isn't shy about flexing his power. In November, in a televised address, he told the nation, "I hear some people want to disorganize us, acting foolish. We fought to bring peace in this country. No one has better weapons than us. No one knows how to fight better than us." A few weeks later, at least 54 people were left dead when the army and police broke up riots across the country after Bobi Wine was detained for 2 days. It was one of the bloodiest protests in Uganda's history. As the campaigns kicked off, I joined 33-year-old Liliana Bear in Isambia Chirombe, a slum not too far from downtown Kampala. She's the president's senior advisor on youth affairs. But areas like these are Bobi Wine's heartland. He himself grew up in a ghetto, as he calls it, and it's these humble roots that endear him to the electorate. As Lillian tried to convince many of the young people here to switch allegiance, the same 2 questions were fired back at her. Why won't Museveni leave power? And what has he done for us after 35 years in charge? Bobi Wine is tapping into frustrations over unemployment, poor education, and healthcare. But some ask if he isn't just another populist politician who, once in office, would end up repeating Museveni's mistakes. What does he really believe in? I spoke to Superior Molly Sasarabo, who's 24 and recently left Uganda for what she calls political exile in Nairobi. In 2019, she was the face of student protests over a fees hike at Makerere University. For that, she was abducted by people she believes were plainclothes soldiers, badly beaten, and left barely conscious. She briefly joined Bobi Wine's party, but left because he lacked a clear ideology. Bobi Wine has often been criticised for his lack of experience. When I've asked him about this, he contended that his goal isn't to have all the answers himself, but to create a platform on which the most brilliant Ugandans can solve the nation's problems. And he says that starts with removing Museveni from power.
That was Catherine Byaruhanga. You are listening to From Our Own Correspondent with me, Pascal Harter, on the BBC World Service. Lockdowns are back in many European countries as COVID infection rates climb and the number of people needing hospital beds mounts. The figures off the charts that we were using back in March. For the fit and the healthy, the young and the energetic, it's also harder now. It's cold midwinter in the Northern Hemisphere, making days dark and short. Be patient, do your part, there's light at the end of the tunnel, is the message from governments and scientists trying to roll out the various vaccines. But it's a task requiring monumental coordination. Training and organising the staff, ordering the syringes, the right packaging, developing the system for who goes first and how. Everything has to be factored in. That's even before you think about how to safely store the vaccine. In Germany, Jenny Hill has been to the headquarters of one company whose products play a vital role in the process.
In midwinter, Germany's forests are enchanting. Wander through them as snow falls on the dark pines and needles crunch underfoot, and it's tempting to imagine the ghosts of those who once walked this way before you. My mind never fails to conjure the 19th century artists, painters like Caspar David Friedrich or poets like Hölderlin, whose work, inspired by these landscapes, shaped a romantic age. But increasingly these days, I think too of those compelled to study the natural world, the frock-coated scientists, the inventors, whose creations, the Bunsen burner, the Petri dish, would help forge this country's future. That tradition continues today in Baden-Württemberg. The state is famous for the grand beauty of the Schwarzwald or Black Forest, but it's also known informally within Germany as the region which makes things. Near the town of Tuttlingen, ugly industrial estates squat among the woodland. For decades, small family firms have quietly prospered here, developing and manufacturing equipment for hospitals and laboratories. In one of those factories, I recently watched workers hammering and drilling around the clock to meet surging demand for industrial freezers, the kind needed to transport and hold the German-developed Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, which offers hope to countries and economies locked down by COVID, but which has to be stored at minus 70 degrees Celsius. The chief executive, an energetic man whose wiry, dark grey curls had receded so far as to leave him bald on top, cast a careful eye along the production line. Peter Binder told me that recently his phone hadn't stopped ringing. Logistics companies, governments from all over the world, desperate to ensure the smooth rollout of the vaccine. His firm was enjoying a fair amount of media attention too. Normally, he said, with some satisfaction, you have to be a football player or something like that if you want to be famous. Now scientists, people like us, are getting recognition. Peter gestured out of a window at the snowy forests beyond. This area, he said, used to be dirt poor. Then people started their companies. People like his father, who he said 100 years ago invented a hot air sterilizer, which he then began to sell to medical and scientific establishments. Here it is. He ushered me through to reception, where his father's original product still occupied pride of place. He gestured at a display of metal chests, his own inventions and products. He showed me a case, which he intriguingly referred to as an aging chamber. It can simulate the conditions under which a medicine will lose its efficacy and is used to determine the shelf life of a product. He enthusiastically steered me back to the factory floor, courteous but clearly impatient to check on production. Inside, machines stamped and cut sheets of metal. Workers deftly connected wires, assembled the freezers. We watched as they carefully packaged one up and a forklift truck bundled it into a waiting lorry. "Off to save the world," he exclaimed. Peter told me he'd recently taken on new staff, but decided against opening another site to meet the ever-increasing demand. At the time, other vaccines were still in trial. They would be cheaper, easier to transport and store. Peter predicted that demand for his freezers wouldn't continue indefinitely. For a moment, I imagined him, like one of those early scientists, lost in thought at a cluttered workbench. I asked what he'd work on next. With a snort of laughter, he banished my romantic notions. "I'm going to retire, sell up, move to the Côte d'Azur," he joked. Actually, he became serious again. I'd like to hand the company down, in good working order, to my son. He looked up at the sky, grey and chilly. "When I go to heaven," he mused, "I want to look down and still see the logo with my family name, Binder." Then he paused, brow furrowed. "I mean, that's if they let me in." Politely, I suggested that heaven might take into account his work on the freezers, his contribution to the rollout of the vaccine. He looked over at the frozen forests behind us. "Yes," he said thoughtfully. "Perhaps they'll let me in, after all."
That was Jenny Hill. Even before COVID-19 hit, the South American nation of Venezuela was suffering from a deep socioeconomic crisis. It's been in a downward spiral for years, with accusations that President Nicolás Maduro and his ruling Socialist Party have pushed the country to its limit. Hyperinflation has skyrocketed. Every day, millions of Venezuelans struggle to access fuel, water, electricity, and medicine. The political discontent has pushed many to leave the country and look for work and a livable wage elsewhere. But as our correspondent Katie Watson found on a recent trip to the capital Caracas, there are those who have done well in recent years.
El Ávila is a mountain range that overlooks Caracas. The capital's residents climb it, marvel at it, and most of all, feel deeply proud of the beauty that towers over the city, in a country whose splendour can often be hard to see amid economic crisis and suffering. Perched high on the ridge of El Ávila is another icon, the Hotel Humboldt. Built in 1956, the cylindrical tower complex was the pet project of dictator Marcos Pérez Jiménez at a time of great oil wealth. It was a show of pomp and modernity, and a demonstration by Venezuela that it could project its power abroad. It operated as a hotel for just a few years before falling into disrepair. But former President Hugo Chavez wanted to restore it to its former glory, and after his passing in 2013, his successor, Nicolás Maduro, was intent on getting it done at last. It's taken time, 9 years to be precise, but the hotel has just started accepting overnight guests, at the cost of around $300 a night. To get there, you have to take a cable car to the top of the mountain. At the top, a golf buggy greets you and drives you along the ridge, past stalls selling bits and pieces to tourists, and Caraqueños enjoying a bit of mountain cold in the Caribbean. Then you arrive at the impressive glass and aluminium structure of the Humboldt. This building means so much for the Venezuelan people, one of the managers, Carlos Salas, told me, as he animatedly showed me the lounge, an immense space that feels more like a glass-sided hangar, with views extending down to Caracas and towards the coast. It's a representation of a golden era for Venezuela, he said. But that golden era seems long gone. Is there the demand, I ask? After all, Venezuela's economic woes are well documented. He responds unflinchingly, arguing that five-star hotels aren't within everyone's reach anywhere in the world. Venezuela is no different. Clearly, a lot of hard work has been put into restoring this architectural jewel, but it's not your typical five-star lodgings. For a start, its 5 stars were handed out by the same government that posts videos of the president walking around the building showing it off. But it's also not finished. It still feels a little rough around the edges. And it didn't take long to clock something strange. In every corner of the glass panes, and most of the building is glass, were huge collections of wasps, hundreds of them huddled together. I was told not to worry. The cold weather means they're too dozy to sting. While we were there, we visited the casino, although we weren't allowed to film inside. It was buzzing, not unlike the wasps, croupiers dealing cards to dozens of guests, mostly men, who looked like they were gambling alone. It felt like a bubble, a secret one almost, and a very different world to the poor and struggling Caracas down below. The hotel is seen by many as a symbol of the new class of wealth in Venezuela. Boligarchs, they're called, a tongue-in-cheek nickname for those who benefited from the so-called Bolivarian socialist revolution started by Hugo Chavez. And you could see that clearly. The night we were there, they were putting on a special Christmas dinner. It was just before last month's elections, a vote that the opposition had boycotted. Election observers, handpicked by the government, were dining in large groups, on a menu costing $100 a head. According to the promotional literature, the meal took diners on a journey around Venezuela, told through hallacas, a maize meal patty filled with ingredients including beef, chicken and vegetables, traditional Christmas fare in Venezuela. At that price, I was expecting to be blown away by the cuisine, but what landed in front of us was a series of nearly identical hallacas, some with pork, olives and raisins, others with capers, chicken or peppers, and all accompanied by other bits of beige, mostly fried food. Outdone by course 2, we cut our losses and left, reassuring the eager-to-please waiters that the meal was delicious, but we needed to return to our hotel for an early start the next morning. Then we did the most Venezuelan of things and asked for the remaining plates to be boxed up. With most Venezuelans struggling to afford 3 meals a day, such abundance felt uncomfortable. So we took the food back down the mountain to hand out to those who needed it most.
Katie Watson, now back from Caracas. That's all for this programme, but we will be back next weekend with more stories of the lives behind the headlines. So do join us then here on the BBC World Service for more from our own correspondent with me, Pascal Harter.
You're listening to the BBC World Service and the sights and sounds of Bulgaria.
Art is a place, no matter of what political, ideological beliefs, no matter what our sexual preferences, we can have amazing experience together.
Until 1989, Bulgaria was a communist-controlled state. In the last 30 years, the country and its art scene has undergone a cultural transformation.
The state would like to present one identity. My task to tell these unknown hidden stories.
I'm Tracy Harris, and I'm meeting 3 extraordinary Bulgarian artists to uncover how their experimental art reflects modern-day Bulgaria and the country's difficult past.
I wanted to try and overlay these 2 spaces of Bulgarian history and to sort of examine it by putting myself in it.
Bulgaria's art on the edge at bbcworldservice.com.
Today, Jessie Thistle is a celebrated professor of Indigenous history in Canada. Jessie's childhood wasn't easy. He struggled at school and turned to drugs.
I came home and I put my hoodie on the dresser and a bag of Coke fell out onto the floor. My grandmother saw it first. She called my grandfather up. He yelled at me. They just kicked me out right away. It was like my world ended.
The story of how a homeless Indigenous man found his identity and his calling on Outlook after the news.
BBC News, we're Jerry Smith. The Indonesian authorities say they've located the black box flight recorders of the plane that crashed into the sea on Saturday, minutes after takeoff from Jakarta. 62 people were on board the Boeing 737. Search teams have recovered wreckage from the water. Landslides have hit Indonesia's West Java province, killing at least 11 people. Dozens more are missing after heavy rain caused mud flows, burying residents in the town of Sumedang. A spokesman for Afghanistan's Public Protection Force has been killed, along with 2 others, by a bomb attack in Kabul. It's the latest in a series of assassinations of government officials, journalists and human rights activists. The attack coincides with the resumption of peace talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban. The US Vice President Mike Pence has appeared to distance himself further from Donald Trump by planning to attend Joe Biden's inauguration. Mr. Trump says he won't be at the ceremony, which takes place in 10 days' time. The social networking app Parler has accused major technology firms of staging a coordinated attack on free speech, after Amazon became the latest to take action against it. Taiwan has welcomed a decision by the United States to lift long-standing restrictions on official contacts between them. The State Department said the previous rules were imposed decades ago to appease China, which claims the territory. Voters in Kazakhstan are casting their ballots in parliamentary and municipal elections. They're the first under President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. The ruling Nur Otan, or Radiant Fatherland Party, is certain to win. And a new law has taken effect in Sweden, giving the government power for the first time to close venues such as shops and cinemas to control the coronavirus. BBC News.
Hello, I'm Anu Anand, and you're with Outlook on the BBC World Service. We're the place to come to for amazing life stories. Today's show takes us to Canada and the life of Jessie Thistle. Jessie's story is the story of many young Indigenous Canadians who are far more likely to suffer addiction, homelessness, and violence as a result of centuries of discrimination. Jessie has both Métis and Cree Indigenous ancestry on his mother's side. His father is white Canadian. He grew up in a road allowance community, literally a strip of land beside a road or railway line, which Indigenous people were packed onto after being dispossessed of their ancestral lands in the late 19th century. His life mirrors the Indigenous community's challenge to survive. Jessie not only survived jail, the streets, death threats, and a horrific accident, he triumphed by reaching the pinnacle of academic success and becoming an expert on Indigenous history. His story starts when his parents, from vastly different cultures, fell in love.
My mom was a very young girl when my father, who came from Toronto, in the most urban space in Canada, he dealt drugs and was kind of an outlaw, a little street hustler, and got in trouble with the law all the time. And so he ran away to northern Saskatchewan, where there was basically no law. And that's where he met my mom, my teenage mother, and they had 3 boys, me, my brother Jerry, and Josh, in quick succession. My father was only 21 by the time all 3 of us came. My mom would have been, 18 or 19, and my dad had a heroin addiction and alcoholism. My mom really didn't know what those were. She was the first generation out of the bush, really. Her dad was a trapper, someone who hunted and picked berries and fished, and so she didn't know what she was getting into with my dad.
So here are your parents from very different communities. They met very young and they had 3 boys very quickly. What happened between them?
Well, my dad promised my mom that he would stay sober and get clean. He had addiction issues, and he only lasted about 3 days, I believe. And He had problems with violence. He was abusive to my mother, and so she fled from the situation. She took us three boys, and she tried to make a go of it on her own. And one day he showed up, and he looked like he was doing well. He said all the right things, and my mom, because she was tired, I think, let us boys go into his custody, and he said he was going to take us back to Toronto. And because he had addiction issues, he used to leave us three boys in the apartment all the time and without food. And he would take off for a day or two or three. That happened repeatedly, enough that a neighbor across the hall noticed what was going on and called child services to come and get us boys. And my dad had trained my brother Jerry and I and my brother Josh to hide an event that was in our room. And when the police came to get us, we all scrambled into the vent and hid in there. And so I was just in there with my brothers huddled and trying to keep quiet and crying. And I remember that. And I remember getting yanked out. And we were just shaking like leaves, being terrified of the police. We didn't really know who these people were and why they were trying to take us away. And then we just ended up in an orphanage, I think is what it was. I don't even know.
So you were only 4.
Yeah.
You're now estranged from your mother, estranged from your father. You go through this traumatic experience and you end up with your father's parents. Were you in touch with your mother at this point?
No, I don't know why child services never called. I assume they never called my mom because back then there was something in Canada called the 60s scoop. And that's like a lot of the way that Indigenous kids were taken out of their family unit and placed in white homes. And so I didn't know at the time, it was years later that I came to the conclusion, why didn't they just call my mom? I believe they didn't call her because she was Indigenous. And they called my white grandparents in Toronto because they're white. And that's why we went to their home.
And what was it like there?
It was hard. My grandfather was kind of a disciplinarian. He believed in like work, really hard work, and he would hit us if we did stuff bad, and he was just old school, and that's what they did.
Now, I assume at this point you're going to school. Do you identify with your Indigenous heritage? Do you feel like you are Indigenous?
Well, we knew we were quote-unquote Indian, because I remembered my mom, and my brother remembers living in a teepee one summer in Saskatchewan, and he went around told all the kids that. And like, I got to tell you, there's no other faster way in Canada to get beat up in grade school than telling other white kids around you that you lived in a teepee and you look native. So we fought all the time because of that, and it was tough. And so eventually I just started telling everybody I was Italian because it made my life easier. And I just started to deny who I was, and eventually I equated indigeneity, or being Indigenous, with my mom, and I started to hate my mom and hate my heritage because she wasn't around and I felt like she had ditched us. I just came to hate myself. That itself is a kind of mechanism of colonialism where you just want to fit in and you don't want to be who you are.
With all those negative connotations, was there anything around in the culture at the time that made you proud or aware of your heritage?
Well, I do remember an Iron Maiden song, Run to the Hills, that was really popular when I was growing up.
About Britain's colonization of Indigenous lands and their battle with the Cree.
So when I listened to the words of the song, it was about like giving them whiskey, killing the bison, taking our land, forcing people to the hills. That was something that I always questioned within me. Am I Cree? Did that happen to my people? I didn't know.
How did you get on at school?
Well, my grades weren't very good. I didn't really learn how to read properly, and that eventually led me to early experimentations with drugs and trouble. I would steal, I would lie, and I joined a gang called the Bud Boys, and that soon became my identity, where I could like really lose myself in drum and bass and MDMA, ketamine, crystal meth, all these different drugs for 3 and 4 and 5 days in a row.
But you've got your grandfather warning you not to go down that path. He's a old-fashioned disciplinarian. So what happens when they find out that you are dealing and taking all these different drugs?
Yeah, I came home and I put my hoodie on the dresser and a bag of Coke fell out onto the floor. It was like my world ended. My grandmother saw it first. She called my grandfather up. He yelled at me. And I could see I broke both their hearts. They just kicked me out right away. And so I packed my stuff into garbage bags, and I caught a ride with a friend that was going out to Vancouver, basically to hide. I was shameful. I just wanted to run away from what I had done. When I got out to Vancouver, I stayed with my brother. Josh had become a cop. And when I got there, I had these addiction issues, and I kept using. And I would nick his badge, and I would pretend that I was a police officer. I'd go around to pick up girls. I would tell them that I was a cop. Girls love police. And I would also tell all the local restaurants where we lived that I was a police officer, so they would give me free food. And one day he came home and I was using drugs. My buddy Leroy had followed me out there, and he caught us, and instead of arresting us, he kicked us out. And I became homeless for the first time in my life. I lived in a car with Leroy down by the Fraser River, and it was a horrible, horrible experience. And they were mostly indigenous peoples that were on the streets. It actually broke my heart to see like all these indigenous people out there with addiction issues, and just nobody cared.
How old were you at this point, Jesse? And how did you survive?
I was 20 years old, and we started begging, and we stayed like that for about 4 months in that car. I knew I was going to die if I didn't leave, and so I hitchhiked across the country back to Toronto.
Now that led you into even more trouble. It's New Year's Eve on the millennium, and you've been to a party and something terrible happens.
Yeah, well, I was at a party in New Year's, and I got really drunk, and I was making out with a girl, and then I went back to my Uncle Ron's. The next day, I went down to my buddy's house. There was a couple of people there who I was acquaintances with, and they asked me to order a pizza. They asked me to help them look for a ride out west because they knew I had lived out west. I hitchhiked, and they asked me to smoke a joint with them. And so I did all three. And the one guy, he gave me a jersey for the favors that I did for him, and I didn't think much about it. And I put the jersey on, and then I went back to my uncle's and I watched a movie with him, and there was breaking news that came across the screen that there was a cabbie that was killed in Brampton on New Year's, so the night before, and they described the two guys, and they kind of matched the description of the two guys that had asked me to give them the pizza and who gave me the jersey and whatever. And I realized, wow, those are the two guys that did it. And they gave me the clothes that they did it in, and they got me to order the pizza and pay the pizza guy and look for a ride out west for them. They were trying to frame me with this murder that they committed. And so I was left with a choice. Keep my mouth shut. That's the code of the streets, you don't tell on people. Or stand up for justice and do the right thing, because the cabbie had 2 kids, it said in the newscast. And so I had to act. And so I went and I called the police, and they took me into custody, and I think I remained a suspect in their investigation for a while they were building a case against these 2 guys. And eventually those 2 guys were convicted of the crime. But what that did is word got out on the street that I had told, and so I became like a dead man walking. I betrayed what we're supposed to keep our mouth shut.
And did you become a target as well for revenge?
Yes, yeah. People actively tried to lure me places so that they could ambush me. That happened a couple times. I was beaten with a baseball bat. People tried to knife me. All kinds of stuff happened.
What kind of an impact emotionally and mentally did that have on you?
Well, I just was always on the run, always going to the next place, always fearful for my life, always on high alert. They call it hypervigilance. I just had to survive and bounce from place to place.
It got even worse for Jesse. He ended up in his brother Jerry's apartment in Toronto. One night they both went to a Halloween party, which Jesse left to score drugs. When he got back to Jerry's house at 4 a.m., it was all locked up. Jesse wasn't allowed his own set of keys, so he banged on the door but got no answer. He even tried to pick the lock but couldn't manage it. So he climbed out of the building's hallway window and shimmied along to the apartment's open window, which was 35 feet above the ground. He got to the window ledge, tried to hoist himself in, but slipped. He landed on his feet to break his fall, something he'd learned in judo. Paramedics couldn't believe he'd survived.
I fell 3.5 stories and I destroyed my heel and broke both wrists, and I went to the hospital, and infection set in because I had this major surgery that I couldn't take care of because I was an addict and I didn't listen to the doctor's orders, and the infection just got worse and worse over time. And so I knew that I was going to lose my leg. It was starting to go necrotic, and there were like rotten flesh, gangrenous, and so I know jail's a safe place to go, and why don't I do a crime to go to jail? Because I'll be safe in there. I'll have a place to rest. I can have access to food and medication. And so I committed a robbery. I robbed a 7-Eleven, and I even did that wrong because my intention was to get arrested, but I got scared halfway through. I ran away and I jumped in a dumpster around the back of the store and covered myself in garbage and hid from the police, and they didn't catch me initially. And I was left there in this garbage bin thinking like I can't even rob a store properly. And I eventually just turned myself in.
What did you say to the police when you turned yourself in?
I just said, I'm the guy who robbed the store. I was really just trying to hide from the world, hide from my addictions, hide from all like the mistakes that I'd done, all the people that I'd hurt along the way, and I just wanted to die. I wanted to rot away and die. And I remember just telling him, throw away the key and lock me up.
Gosh, I can't imagine what state you must have been in when going to prison is a really big step up. And so you go to prison, presumably you get immediate help with your leg, with your health, but you also have to quit drugs cold turkey. Is that a turning point for you?
Yeah, it was one of them. It was the first time in my life since I was a teen that I'd come off like crack and crystal and all the different drugs that I was using. And so I had a horrible withdrawal. I remember just shaking and cursing God and my life and just wanting a second chance at things.
And Jesse, you do get a second chance. I mean, not only does prison, sadly, in a way, give you some physical comfort, health care, safety, but you see in prison that there are other possibilities, things you can learn.
Yeah. They released me, after the initial robbery, but I kept getting in trouble. I kept going back to jail, off and on, until one time I just saw that there was this guy who didn't get in trouble. He didn't trade chocolate bars. He wasn't into drugs. He just was doing his time like a gent, and I wanted that. And so I walked up to him one day. I said, "What are you doing with all these papers?" And he says, "I'm doing my high school." And he got me to read his assignment, and I kind of stumbled through it a little bit. It took me a long time, but I eventually got through it, and he helped me access the chaplaincy, and I started taking my high school in jail. I felt good about myself for the first time in many, many years.
And at one point, your brother Jerry visited you, and he had some bad news about your grandmother.
Yeah, she had issues with her heart, and she was also in the early stages of leukemia, but we didn't know it then. And so she was on her way out.
Did you go and see her?
When I got released, I went to a place called Harvest House, which is a rehab in Ottawa. And while I was in this treatment program, she contacted Harvest House and she said, "Listen, Jesse, I'm dying and I need to see you." And so I told the program, and they made a way for me to go and see her with my Alcoholics Anonymous sponsor. And when she was in there, she kind of gave me a tongue lashing. She's like, "Don't be such an idiot, I'm really disappointed in you, And like, I want you to make me a promise. Follow through with this education. You got to go through university and go as far as you can. And so I just like, whatever, Grandma, whatever you want, just get better. So it wasn't really a promise. It was just something I was saying to her to get better. And then we hugged, and I went back to Harvest House, and 2 weeks later she died. She died. And I always carried that promise with me from then on. You know, I always remembered, like, do my best in school, because I made that promise to my grandmother. And it changed me. It gave me a purpose, actually, that promise.
And what about your mother?
Yeah, my mom, she tracked me down when I was in rehab. I got this strange email one day that this woman was looking for me. I called the number that was given, and I just started talking to her, and I started crying, and I can't really remember what we were talking about. I remember shaking on the phone and just so many emotions coming over me that my mom loved me.
You actually hung up a few times, didn't you? Because you were just so scared of probably all of the emotions that were going to overtake you.
Yeah, I was terrified, right? I was terrified of being rejected, terrified of love. To like go back and try to reconnect with your mom, it's terrifying. And so I was scared. Hear me, at the time, big 200-pound guy, just terrified to talk to his mom. But like, it was a beautiful, beautiful conversation. I just remember the way I feel, and it was like a rain quenching the prairies after a long drought. That's what it felt like.
Now, you're also passing your high school exams, and not just passing them, but doing really well. What was it that you liked so much about studying?
Well, to fight the cravings from crack, I started reteaching myself how to read and write, and looking over encyclopedias, and I took etiquette courses to reteach me how to eat at a table and take care of my hygiene, all the things that I'd forgotten because I'd been drifting around so long. That all brought hope to my heart and honoring the promise to my grandmother.
After your grandmother passed away, someone from your school days, someone from when you were quite young, got in touch with you over Facebook. Who was that?
Yeah, it was Lucy. I'd known Lucy since I was like 10 years old. She had this really flaming red hair, and I've always been a sucker for red hair. So she sent me this message on Facebook, and I didn't even really know what Facebook was. I'd been off the radar for so long. And her message was consoling. She's like, I heard your grandmother died, and I hope you're well. And I think I fell in love with her at that moment just because she was kind. And so I wanted to impress her. And I guess I did, because we eventually got together, when I graduated rehab. She took me in and gave me a place to stay for the first time in many, many years.
So she is the love that kind of brings you back to a full life. What is that like? What do you feel like being with her?
Well, I felt like for the first time in my life that I was home.
So in 2012, you go to York University in Toronto, and you start studying history.
Yeah, I had an assignment in my second year that got the students to look at their life in the context of Canadian colonization. So how did your family get to Canada? How are you living in Toronto? Where are you from in the world? And I had to look at my Indigenous heritage. I knew that was the key to my sobriety and my well-being. And so I really took that assignment seriously, and I phoned back to Saskatchewan, and I contacted my Auntie Vaughn, who'd been doing a lot of family research, and she sent me her link to Ancestry.com. And I opened the link and I looked at it, and I saw all these Native people, all these chiefs, and I knew the key back to myself was through this assignment. And so I poured my heart into it, and I wrote about my Métis ancestors and what happened with the Battle of Batoche and the Northwest Resistance and how we lost our lands. And I handed it in, and she right away kicked it up to a professor who is an expert in Métis history on the plains. And she knew who my family were. She knew our family history. And she hired me on to be what's called a research assistant on one of her major grants. And she flew me back home to Saskatchewan to really reconnect with my mom and my aunties. And you got to think, I hadn't been back to Saskatchewan since I was 3.5, 4 years old. It was so was like a homecoming. It was a beautiful, beautiful homecoming.
Was there a kind of light bulb moment where, what you knew about your mother's ancestors, that Iron Maiden song when you were a kid, your own Cree, Métis ancestry, all of that just suddenly came together and you sort of knew who you were?
Yeah. It happened when I went back to the road allowance where I was when I was a little boy. I spent some time on the road allowance with my Kukum and Mushum. That's my grandma and grandpa.
When you grow up and you just don't have a sense of your history, in a way you sort of don't exist. And when you reconnect with that in a physical way through history, it sort of transforms how you feel about yourself.
Exactly. When I started looking at this history and reconnecting with my family in Saskatchewan and seeing that, look, us Métis and Cree people, we're actually very proud people that we stood up and fought for our land, that everything was taken away from us, and that's why we ended up impoverished. It wasn't our fault. It was the way that we were dispossessed. I became very proud. I'm proud to be from people that stood up for what they believed in. It filled me with such pride, and I continue to use that pride and who I am as an Indigenous person. I share that with the world now.
It is just such an incredible transformation. You go from being a former homeless person, an ex-addict, an ex-convict, and you get the best grades, and you get not one but two extremely competitive doctoral scholarships, and you go on to do your PhD. So you're now teaching as an assistant professor in Indigenous Studies at York University. What does that entail?
As a professor, I teach Indigenous history. And I get a lot of disconnected Indigenous youth that come into my classrooms looking for a connection back to their ancestry. And so I help them understand who their ancestors were, the history around some of the dispossession and, why their family ended up where they are, just like the professors did with me. And it's a beautiful thing to watch people get to know and meet their ancestors.
One other really wonderful, heartening thing about the way that your life has come together personally and professionally. You go and do a lot of field research, and your mom comes with you. Is that right?
Yeah, my mom is my research assistant because my mom knows the community and she has a really good, relationship with all the people that I have to talk to.
And for us, it was like a big, exciting thing because we meet everybody.
And here is Jesse's mom out on a field trip with him.
All the Métis families would come, eh?
But Tosh is 27 kilometers away from Fish Creek. They travel long distances to fight one another. From here to Balfour to Batosh, Duck Lake.
So it's great to take her and my auntie. My auntie Yvonne is a great historian, and she's just done tons of work too. And so they're the best research assistants that I can have. It's great because we can work through just our broken relationship as son and mother. It's difficult at times. It's not always easy, but it's beautiful. Sometimes we'll just laugh for a half hour straight because we didn't have the time in our lives to really connect that way. So we're just joyous to be in each other's company. And I say that our research methodology is based on love because we bring that love on the road with us.
Jesse Thistle speaking to me from Toronto. He's written a best-selling memoir, From the Ashes. Any comments, please email us. We're on outlook@bbc.com. I'm Anu Anand. Thanks for tuning in to Outlook. That's all for now.
This is the BBC World Service, continuing our series of US presidential profiles.
This is a moment of real consequence for America.
Kamala Harris is making history.
She's a trailblazer. She's someone who has broken barriers.
Join me, Mark Coles, for an in-depth look at the prosecutor turned politician.
Presidential Profiles, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. Tuesday at 9:20 GMT. And in 30 minutes, Heart and Soul.
Malta is the only country in Europe to fully ban abortion. But are attitudes in this staunchly Catholic island changing? And has the pandemic played a part in that?
Next, Work, Life, India, here on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Namaste and welcome to Work Life India from Delhi here on the BBC World Service. I'm Devina Gupta. This week we're talking about staying fit. COVID has forced many of us to change our exercise habits. From our morning walks in the neighborhood park to our gym routine, the pandemic fears have restricted our outdoor activities. But some have found alternative ways to stay fit, and we talk to them about it all.
In the
early days of the lockdown, it felt as if we were going into depression, and that's when we started online workouts, which was like being in the slow and steady mode to win the race.
Commit to 21 days of a regular meditation and don't overcommit. Choose a 5 to 10 minute meditation.
From exercising to mental health and a balanced diet. To know more about how to develop a fitness routine that works the best for you, join us as we ask how to stay healthy in a pandemic.
BBC News. Hello, this is Jerry Smith. The authorities in Indonesia say they found the black box recorders from a passenger jet that crashed into the sea near Jakarta on Saturday just after takeoff. Search teams hope to retrieve the devices soon, which should provide vital information about why the Boeing 737 plunged into the water. 62 people were on board. Indonesia's President, Joko Widodo, says the authorities are doing their best to find the victims, who include 7 children and 3 babies.
We will do our best to find and save the victims, and together let's pray that they can be found. In the name of the government and Indonesian people, we would like to express our condolences for what has happened.
2 landslides, several hours apart in the same place in Indonesia, have left at least 11 people dead and perhaps dozens more missing. The first landslide on Saturday afternoon was triggered by torrential rain. The second happened in the evening as rescue workers searched for victims of the first disaster. The tragedy in the town of Sumedang on the island of Java is thought to have killed the head of a local disaster relief agency. A spokesman for Afghanistan's Public Protection Force, Zia Wadan, has been killed along with 2 others in a targeted bomb attack in the capital, Kabul. The incident comes as peace talks resume in the Gulf state of Qatar. Here's Eletronay Smith.
The Interior Ministry said Zia Wadan was travelling in morning traffic with colleagues when their vehicle was hit. The attack appears to be yet another in a series of assassinations in Afghanistan, targeting high-profile government officials, journalists and human rights activists. No group has admitted planting the bomb, but the Afghan President Ashraf Ghani has blamed the Taliban, accusing the group of continuing to take innocent lives and questioning the militants' commitment to peace. Talks continue today in the Gulf state of Qatar. The government wants a ceasefire in Afghanistan, but the Taliban insists that can only happen after a new Islamic government has been formed.
Taiwan has welcomed the decision by the United States to lift long-standing restrictions affecting official contacts. Taiwan's Foreign Minister Joseph Wu praised his American counterpart Mike Pompeo, who announced the move. The change in US policy seems bound to infuriate Beijing, which claims the territory. Cindy Su is in Taipei.
There are many people who believe that this is actually a way for Trump to give China one last kick before he leaves office. And in many ways, this new policy of Pompeo's won't really have much impact because Biden might simply ignore it and go back to the decades-long policy the U.S. had practiced, in which it played a neutral balancing act of not antagonizing Beijing, but also not emboldening Taiwan.
News from the BBC. The US Vice President Mike Pence has appeared to distance himself further from Donald Trump by planning to attend Joe Biden's inauguration. Mr. Trump says he won't be at the ceremony in 10 days' time. Mr. Pence had already defied the president by refusing to block confirmation of Mr. Biden's election victory. President Trump is also facing the prospect of being impeached for a second time. Police in Kazakhstan's biggest city, Almaty, have arrested at least 30 people for staging a protest during parliamentary elections that the main opposition party is boycotting. Mobile phone signals in the central square have been turned off. It's the first election since President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev took over from Nursultan Nazarbayev, who led the country for 2 decades. Mr. Nazarbayev still chairs the ruling Radiant Fatherland Party. A new law has taken effect in Sweden, giving the government power for the first time during the coronavirus pandemic to close venues such as shops and cinemas. The measures were passed by Parliament on Friday. Sweden's infection rate is among the highest in the EU. Maddie Savage reports from Stockholm.
Since the start of the pandemic, Sweden's taken a different approach to the rest of Europe, with a focus on voluntary guidelines designed to last months, not weeks, rather than going in and out of lockdown. But this new law allows the government to introduce much stricter measures as the country battles with some of the highest coronavirus infection rates in the EU. Local authorities will have the power to fine businesses that don't follow the rules or force them to close.
A group of spectators have been thrown out of a cricket match between Australia and India for racially abusing an Indian player. The game in Sydney was briefly interrupted after the bowler complained to the umpires. The police then escorted the 5 fans out. There was applause, but also some boos. BBC News.
Well, it's cold winter morning and I am cycling hard because my New Year resolution is to get fit in 2021. Well, COVID restrictions have changed exercise habits for many of us. But there are those who have maintained a healthy routine, and I'm on my way to talk to one such elderly couple living in India's national capital, Delhi. So stay with me as we ask them and our panel how to stay healthy in a pandemic. This is Work Life India, the show where we talk about all the things to do with money, the work we do, and the lives we lead. And I'm Devina Gupta.
One, two, three.
Counting each time he lifts lightweight dumbbells, 70-year-old Surender Nair is aiming to complete at least 50 counts in one go on his terrace.
Actually, when we were not allowed to go to garden, I did experience a lot of loneliness because both of us are living alone here. Our children are abroad. Loneliness is there.
It's 7 o'clock in the morning and it has just rained. The trees around his home are all washed up and brimming with shining green leaves, and the birds are already busy chirping on them. A year ago, Mr. Nair couldn't have imagined climbing the stairs to his terrace to experience such a morning. Both of his knees carry long scars from a recent knee replacement surgery. But Mr. Nair says it was the COVID lockdown that prompted him and his wife to try out an online exercise routine for senior citizens. And that has helped him tremendously. So how did your exercise habits change because of COVID?
In the early days of the lockdown, it felt as if we were going into depression. We didn't know what to do. We had been exercising in the park, so thought, why not try it at home? And that's when we started online workouts, which was like being in the slow and steady mode to win the race.
It's your personal trainer, Coach Kozak.
And I'm Claudia, and this is a workout for seniors and those with limited mobility.
They follow the exercise videos on their mobile phone, which they have positioned against a Bluetooth speaker on a small red plastic stool, which also serves as a makeshift stand. Mr. Nair is constantly encouraging his wife, who's sitting right next to him, wearing a blue-colored traditional Indian long shirt and pants. She may be 70 years old, but her spirit to stay fit is young.
4, 5.
Mrs. Nair tells me this is the first time the couple has spent so much time together after marriage, and she loves it.
Exercising together is so lovely. We have led a very busy life, bringing up children and looking after a home. We started this routine in March last year, and as the days progressed, we have bonded more as well.
Well, their resolve to stay healthy has given me all the motivation I need for 2021. So I decide to join them.
I'm lying down and I can already hear clicks in my knees. You want to do chakrasana? Let's try that. Okay, that is lifting your body up when you're lying down. My hands are at the back and my waist is lifted up, but I can't do it as good as you.
And as I struggled with my yoga pose, The couple says both of them lost nearly 20 pounds each in the past 10 months. But Mrs. Nair admits they do miss the freedom of going to their neighborhood park.
I miss going to the park so much because it was like a morning routine for me. I could walk and meet all my friends there. I feel at home you can only do limited exercises and I miss walking in the gardens.
So, what motivates them still and keeps them going? Mr. Nair says it's all about the compliments he gets on his newly developed abs.
I was feeling uneasy recently, so I went to a doctor. She looked at my admission card details where my age was mentioned as 70 years. She looked up and stared at me from top to bottom and was surprised. She said, "Oh my God, you don't look 70, sir. You're so young." I felt so happy, and that compliment made my day.
Well, that's one compliment to make anyone's day. We're back in the studio and I've managed to change my sweatpants. Taking a cue from this energetic couple, let's dive right in to talk about health and fitness with our panel. We have with us Jitendra Choksi, who's founder of an online fitness community, Fitter. Welcome, Jitendra.
Thanks a lot, Davina.
So, Jitendra, you are 6:30 a.m. riser, and did you relate to some parts of this elderly couple story, especially when they said they transformed from being fat to fit at this age? You, at the age of 14, were also bullied for your weight.
Well, I think I relied more on scientific know-how. Of course, it was not easy as there's a lot of fads and misconceptions that predominantly exist in our country, and so it was all about cutting through these norms, cutting through these conventional myths, and thus finding the right sort of information, which eventually helped me, and then using that same information to help others.
Did you also flaunt your abs once you got them, just like Mr. Nair did in that story?
Absolutely.
Let's come to our second guest on that note. We have Jeenal Shah, who's a nutritionist. She's worked with several Bollywood celebrities and on latest diets to make them fit, but the natural and healthy way. So welcome, Jeenal. You actually get up at 7 a.m. dot on the clock. But last year, any changes that you made to your exercise routine because of COVID and the lockdown?
Firstly, thank you, Devina, for having me here. Yes, in fact, it shifted a little bit. It was much earlier because there was also work from home and work at home. Plus, there was the fitness routine to take care of. So the way I would start my day was that I brush my teeth, I eat something, and then I first get my Surya Namaskars done and then get moving with the rest of my day.
So Surya Namaskara, sun salutation and part of the yoga exercise. And on that note, let me introduce the third guest, the yoga guru and expert, Ira Trivedi. Welcome, Ira. I know you've gotten up today at 5:30 then. You did your MBA from Columbia University, switched to practicing yoga for over 16 years now. But Ira, was last year the toughest time that you saw in the fitness industry as well? And a lot of people, though, adapted to yoga at that time. Right now, do you see some sort of a COVID fatigue setting in?
Absolutely. I would say not. In fact, 2020 has been the best year for yoga in decades. It's been a real turning point in at least 2 decades. Taking yoga online has given so much opportunity to teachers because now they don't need a physical space anymore. And the switch over to online is a permanent shift. I think people will not go back to studios as much and with that much frequency, and studios are going to become more of a premier space. So just like the couple was doing, the elderly couple, right? They realized that just doing it at home, attaching to a speaker and a television can give them the workout. Then why would people take the trouble now of leaving their homes and doing all that commuting, worrying about hygiene standards when they can do it from the comfort of their homes?
Yes, in fact, practicing some yoga poses with the couple on their terrace made me realize that I do need to pay more attention to my fitness also. But this is interesting what you say right now, Ira, that the technology has actually helped a lot of people get rid of those excuses that you couldn't do it earlier, you couldn't walk to the gym, you couldn't go to and book an instructor, or you couldn't pay also for these expensive classes. It's become more affordable.
Or that there was nothing close to you. The biggest problem was the lack of access of a teacher. And now what's happening is that I'm sitting in India, and even me, As a teacher, I can get access to so many more teachers around the world. There are no more excuses.
No more excuses. But Jitendra, you've been an avid gym goer, and once the gyms were shut, did you miss that?
Yeah, so look, for me, weight training is extremely important, and so definitely I missed the gym initially, but I had also realized that I have to indulge in weight training, and so I switched my exercise to more home-based workouts, where I switched to full body calisthenics, where you use your body as weight. So I did that.
All right. But Jinal, you actually made your trip to the gym recently. Tell us about what was it like on the first day, because there was a survey done by Gympic, which is a fitness aggregator. It surveyed around 50,000 people, and it said that 93% of those people were apprehensive and had doubts about the sanitization process and whether they should start working out there. Tell us your experience.
Even for me, there was a little bit of nervousness initially, but when I went there, I realized that there were just 3 or 4 of us in the gym. Hope that there is lesser fear and people start coming in and getting back to their fitness routine.
But let me shift gears. We also want to take some of the queries that our audience has been sending us. So let's take our first query, which is from Pragya in Delhi.
I contracted COVID in December last year. Before, I used to exercise and run a lot, but now after recovering, I'm not able to do so. So, what can I do to regain my stamina?
Ira, so this question is to you. Did you face similar kind of situation with your clients, those who have recovered after being infected from COVID and are trying to get their strength back? What is your advice to them?
So I'll tell you one thing. While yoga may not help you, may not prevent COVID-19, right? What yoga can help you and does help you is with recovery. We've had so many students who've had COVID-19, and each one of them say that yoga practice helped me bounce back very quickly, especially the breathing practices. So we have had such a positive feedback from people who've had COVID-19 and their bounce back rates.
And Gina, let me come to you on that note. A lot of people would have that question that what kind of a diet should I have if I'm experiencing lack of strength or loss of stamina?
Well, I feel, the lockdown as well as COVID by itself has given us the opportunity to really re-establish our connect with home food, traditional food, and with our kitchens. The one thing that the kitchen brings out is a whole lot of strength, stamina, and immunity. To give you one small example, when you fall sick or even with something like COVID, the one food that you will be okay to have is khichdi, and it gives you everything. It's easy to digest. We didn't have enough domestic help. There's not much cleaning that you need to do if you're having something like a khichdi. It's also tasty at the same time, and it gives you all the nutrients that you need to just get up and get moving, to overcome something like COVID.
All right. So khichdi again is a mixture of rice and pulses. Jitendra, what about you? Did you see some of your clients who were infected with COVID and then they came back to the exercise routine? What kind of advice did you give them and what was their experience?
The only key here is consistency, and you might take 6 months or a full year to make that recovery. When your lung capacity is at your optimal. So just be persistent. So it's just a matter of time.
But do you advise them to take it slow, or do you tell them that watch out for certain parameters? Because a lot of people have been experiencing breathlessness.
So yes, it would be my advice to make sure that you take things gradually. Depending on your level of expertise, if you're a beginner, then probably be easier just by doing body weight exercises before you make a full-fledged recovery and go back to the gym lifting heavyweight squats.
All right. Well, on that note, let's shift to our second query. And this is from the northern Indian city of Chandigarh, where Pritika wants to ask question to our panel.
During the pandemic, I've been very concerned about my nutrition and what I should eat and what not. So is there any diet in particular that we can follow to help boost our immunity? Also, is there anything particular we must eat every day that could help us avoid contracting COVID?
All right, Gina, this is up your alley because I do know a lot of people have been asking you about the immunity diet.
Well, a few things that you must include on a daily basis. Number one is ghee or clarified butter. The way to do it is try to make it at home and add a teaspoon in your breakfast, lunch, and dinner each on a daily basis. The other thing that should be there in the daily diet is local seasonal fresh fruit. The third thing that works really well is a diversity of grains like jawar, or call as pearl millet, ragi, which is finger millet, all of these ancient grains which have their own traditional preparations. And you use those preparations to make things like a dosa, or to make things like a khichdi, or you make things like a porridge. And the last thing that will work really well is seeds and nuts. Just chewing on nuts makes you feel good, and it also has a whole lot of nutrients that allows you to beat the stress.
So, well, dosa is rice pancake, but honestly, what has been your comfort food? I'm sure you've cheated on your own diet as well.
Yes, after things got okay, the first thing I ran for was ragra patties.
All right, that's another snack which is found quite famously in the Western Indian city of Mumbai. But what about you, Ira? What kind of diet did you follow during this time? And was there a point where you also cheated on your diet?
I would say what my temptation is to have that cup of chai or that cup of coffee. Definitely during lockdown, there was a daily practice of having this chai and cake. It was something that I decided and I planned for. So the best way is not to control your urges, but to plan for them. Saying that, you know what, eating a cake and coffee or cake and tea is making me feel good. I'm going to do it 5 times a week, but I'm not going to do it on 2 days of the week. Saying that, you know what, I feel like having a pizza, so I'm going to go for a pizza. But then for the next 2 days, I'm going to make sure that I have enough raw salad or I have a lot of veggies. So you have to plan your meals.
Okay, on that note, let me go to our third query. And this is from Sridhar, who is in Delhi. And let's listen in to what he wants to ask our panel.
People like me who are fond of long distance running, cardio activity, it's simply too dangerous to run outdoors because of the very high air pollution levels. And on the other hand, it's a bit of a scare to run in an enclosed space such as a gym. There's a feeling of being boxed in, being inactive. It takes its toll on the fitness levels. It takes its toll on the mental well-being. So if we could just get some suggestions on this one from the panel of experts.
Jitendra, what would be your advice? Because even I tried cycling early in the morning just to keep up with my New Year resolution for 2021. And in Delhi, it is polluted and there is smog. What's your advice to the clients who would like to do outdoor exercise and they're healthy enough to also go out?
Right. So I think there's nothing wrong with visiting nearby parks as long as you're wearing your mask and maintaining social distance. So we just have to accept the fact that this is a pandemic. Everybody is going through the same trouble, and then we'll just have to make live with it. That's what it is.
Mm-hmm. But the other part of Sridhar's question was also mental well-being. And Ira, that's where I want to come to you, because at a time when we're seeing that the COVID fear is still there, we have a strain that was identified first in the UK of COVID, now making its way to India. And also there's a bird flu scare. So 2021 continues to be filled with anxiety when it comes to our health. What do you suggest? How to alleviate some of these concerns and how to maintain a balanced outlook even in this time of crisis?
So I would say commit. That's the first thing. Commit to 21 days. Commit to 21 days of a regular meditation and don't overcommit. Choose a 5 to 10 minute meditation. If you have 5 to 10 minutes, you can go to an app. Number 2, can I tell you what? Paying for something makes you commit these days. So pay for it. Make sure you pay something not for their sake, but for your own sake. So it keeps you going.
So one way of committing to exercise is paying for it, is what Ira is saying. But Geenal, coming to you, because let me compare these 21 days to what are the other attractions. A latest movie that is streaming or a latest series that is streaming that is keeping you awake late in the night. Your sleep hygiene goes for a toss. So how do you form that routine? What's the one thing that you can do to start?
Well, what you need to do is just make sure that you switch off all your gadgets at a fixed time every single day. So preferably, of course, before midnight, and don't go into beyond 12 o'clock. The other thing that works really well is, to improve your quality of sleep is to just drink a cup of milk with a little bit of haldi. And that will help you to sleep really well in the night. And the last thing that will really help is to take a short nap in the afternoon between 1 to 3 p.m., like a 20-minute short nap. It works beautifully to allow you to get into a good sleeping routine.
So haldi is another word for turmeric. And anyone who's had turmeric latte on the panel? Okay. Jinal, apart from you, nobody has had turmeric latte here.
But as haldi milk.
Yes, as haldi milk or turmeric milk. But that's a great advice coming for someone who wants to have healthy sleep. And with that, let me also wrap up this discussion with just the last pointers, because I started by talking about the wake up time for each and every one of you. And you the ones who are, I can safely say, in the early morning club. Now, for someone who wants to make that start, and I'll start with me in that case, Ira, what's your advice?
You know, Divina, based on your everyone's genetic chronotype, you may be programmed to not actually be a morning person genetically. So don't force yourself to wake up in the morning if you don't feel good doing it. Not everyone does. Don't be so hard on yourself. But if you feel better by waking up in the morning, if you realize that, wow, when I wake up at 6 a.m., everything is better for me. My body functions better. My appetite is better. I'm more positive. Then you should make that switch, but do it with 15-minute increments. That's the best.
All right, you just made me feel so good about myself, Ira. So I'm going to toss this question to Jitendra then. As we've been talking about, technology has made fitness more accessible. But what are the pitfalls that people should be wary of? And the points where they need to seek an expert advice and not follow everything that is online blindly?
What are some of the pitfalls? I'd say over-reliance on these kind of things. Like sometimes, people use these gadgets for accurate calculation of calories, accurate calculation of the caloric burn, and they end up, feeling good about all the things that they didn't do. Most of these gadgets are inaccurate. They should be used with caution, right? So that, and online is filled with plethora of information. You just have to be smart about selecting the right kind of information.
All right, Jitendra, on that note, let me come to Jinal then. Last word to you, because Jinal, I do know that you have a food test on how to identify the right kind of food that you should eat. Tell us about it, and let's end with that.
All right. So there are 3 levels to this. So the first one is the grandmother test. The grandmother test is one, whether your grandmother has grown up eating this food or not. So if you look at like poha versus an oats, for example, so she surely does recognize poha as food and something that she's grown up eating. Oats, maybe she would recognize, but she may not have grown up eating. So then that fails the test. The second test is the versatility test. The versatility test is the ability of a food to be converted to various things. Look at rice, for example. You can make a biryani out of it. You can make just a khichdi out of it. You can just have dal rice. So that's the versatility of rice. So it qualifies the test. And the third test is your food miles test. So how much the food needs to travel from the place that it grows to land onto your plate. The shorter the distance, the better it is for you. So for any diet to be successful, it needs to be sustainable, something that you see yourself doing for the rest of your life.
So poha that you mentioned is Indian breakfast made of rice flakes, and again biryani is another Indian rice dish. So thanks for those tips, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of use for our audience. With that, let's wrap up this show. Thank you everyone for joining us and giving us your time and your expert advice, and I wish you all a healthy and a safe 2021.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, the journey to be fit begins with small steps. So I hope this program helped answer some of your queries and motivated you to follow a healthy lifestyle to be fitter in 2021. I'm already counting my cycling miles. But do share your workout experiences using #WorkLifeIndia. We love to hear from you. You can even write to us on Delhi_WorkLifeIndia@bbc.co.uk. Till we meet next time, it's Namaste from me, Divina Gupta.
This is the BBC World Service. Now here's something to think about.
When someone has a brilliant idea, it's a light bulb moment. But then they have to prove their theory.
We have conducted experiments in many so-called small-scale societies, from the Peruvian jungle to Pacific Islands.
I'm David Edmonds, and in The Big Idea, I'll be examining new research on human reason and rationality.
And what we found was that the more people elaborated, the more they also changed their views.
When you ask people who have recently married whether their marriage will end up in divorce, they normally say close to 0, even when the divorce rates are close to 50%.
Men tip 23% more than women tip.
I found some of the most fascinating ideas around and the people who thought them up.
The Big Idea, today at 14 GMT.
Malta, an island in the Mediterranean Sea steeped in Catholic history that, over the last few years, has seen a number of legislative changes. Divorce, same-sex marriage, even emergency contraception. One issue still remains a crime, however: abortion. But for how much longer? Find out with me, Sophia Smith-Gaylor, in Heart and Soul, after the news.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. The Indonesian authorities have located the black box flight recorders of the passenger plane that crashed into the sea on Saturday, minutes after takeoff from Jakarta. 62 people were on board the Boeing 737. The airline operator, Sriwijaya Air, said the takeoff of the flight had been delayed because of heavy rain. Landslides have hit Indonesia's West Java province, killing at least 11 people. Dozens more are missing after heavy rain caused mudflows, burying residents in the town of Sumedang. A spokesman for Afghanistan's Public Protection Force has been killed, along with 2 others, by a bomb attack in Kabul. It's the latest in a series of assassinations of government officials, journalists and human rights activists. The attack coincides with the resumption of peace talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban. The US Vice President Mike Pence has appeared to distance himself further from Donald Trump by planning to attend Joe Biden's inauguration. Mr. Trump says he won't be at the ceremony, which takes place in 10 days' time. The social networking app Parler has accused major technology firms of staging a coordinated attack on free speech. Amazon has become the latest to take action against Parler, removing the app from its web hosting service. People in Kyrgyzstan are going to the polls to elect a new president and vote in a referendum on how they're governed. The polls are being held 3 months after mass unrest led to the release from jail of the current frontrunner in the presidential race, Sadir Japarov. A new law has taken effect in Sweden, giving the government power for the first time to close venues such as shops and cinemas to control the coronavirus. Sweden's infection rate is among the highest in the EU. The measures were passed by Parliament in Stockholm on Friday. BBC News.
Dear Francesca, I've been seeing a lot of posts and comments re-abortion on this group, and I would like to share my story. But I would like to remain anonymous, as I am worried that if I do share my identity, my line of work will be affected. I'm Francesca Feneconti. I'm an activist. I run a Facebook group called Women for Women, which is mostly Maltese women. We're about, at the moment, almost 40,000 women, just women. And I set it up because there was a need for women to discuss women's issues in a safe space.
Malta, an island that's just over 300 square kilometres in size. It sits in the Mediterranean Sea between Sicily and the North African coast. It has long faced the fate that nearly all islands in history have had to tolerate: invasion, wars and cultural upheaval. But over the past couple of years, there's a newer conflict emerging from within the country itself around its own abortion law. I'm Sophia Smith-Gaylor, and this week for Heart and Soul on the BBC World Service, I'll be speaking to the people who are campaigning against Malta's criminalisation of abortion and how it remains taboo in an overwhelmingly Catholic and anti-abortion society.
I am purely Maltese and I was educated in a church school, so I had very opinionated views about abortion.
That message Francesca was reading goes on to detail the woman's own personal abortion experience. It is estimated that hundreds of Maltese women travel abroad to get abortions every year. Some women, and especially during the coronavirus pandemic, get abortion pills delivered to the island, though due to the taboo and criminalisation of abortions here, for many that's a terrifying move. Francesca doesn't post every single message that she gets. Some people go to her not to necessarily have their message posted, but to seek Francesca's advice because she is a known pro-choice advocate in the country.
Like, listen, we know you're pro-choice, we know we can't trust you, but what can we do? You know, is there any way? And obviously, it's totally illegal in Malta. And what I do is I direct them to the websites like Women on Web and Women Help Women, where they can get the abortion pills. That obviously is only available if they're less than 10, 12 weeks maximum. Other people might report them, you know, there's a prison sentence. I mean, I can never help in any other way, but giving information is not illegal, so I'm not doing anything illegal.
How does it make you feel listening to all these stories? It must be quite a lot to deal with.
I get goose flesh like I'm getting now.
If you've heard people talking about abortion in Europe lately, that conversation has probably been about Poland. Also a Catholic country, it captured headlines in October when it ruled that abortions due to fetal malformation would no longer be allowed. But here is where the countries differ. In Poland, the law against abortion penalises those who assist women in terminating their pregnancies, and it allows abortion in cases of rape, incest, or when a woman's life is at risk. Malta, instead, is the only country in Europe to prohibit and criminalise abortion entirely. Women who seek out abortions face prison sentences alongside any doctor or person who assists them. And if a woman is raped, if her child has a non-viable fetal anomaly, and if her own life is at risk, she cannot, according to Maltese law, end that pregnancy. Argentina, the Pope's native country, has just legalised abortion up to 14 weeks. The Senate vote was not unanimous, and the Catholic Church vocally opposed it. But while some other Catholic countries are challenging abortion laws in the courts, in Malta, for many it is not even up for debate.
I mean, I was brought up in Malta. I went to a church school run by nuns, so I was very, very pro-life myself. It's ingrained in us, you know. We're taught at school that life begins at conception. We're shown this awful film called The Silent Scream, which is there's a baby that's being butchered to pieces, and we're all shown it in fifth form, which is when we're 15, 16. Especially after I had my child, I have a 22-year-old, I realized that, hey, you know, this motherhood thing is really difficult. I mean, I have help, I have money, I'm secure, in a good relationship, and still I'm finding it really difficult. What about other women who might have nobody in the world, be in a domestic violence situation, are sick, have issues, you know? It was a journey. And I think that this journey from pro-life to pro-choice, I really understand that it's difficult for a lot of other women in Malta to be pro-choice.
This suction tip, which you can see moving violently back and forth on the bottom of the screen, is the lethal instrument which will ultimately tear apart and destroy the child.
The Silent Scream was produced in 1984 in the US and documents an abortion happening at 12 weeks. Since its release, it has received widespread praise from anti-abortion voices, but criticism too, including from members of the medical community who have said it's full of misinformation and biases. Like Francesca said, Maltese school children today are still shown it in class, but attitudes among young people are changing. In the last few years, Malta has legalised divorce and same-sex marriage, two other issues that are prohibited in Catholic social teaching. And while views against abortion are in the majority for every age demographic in Malta, the gap between for and against is the slimmest amongst those between 16 and 25.
There's nothing pro-life about forcing a person to suffer.
These are the voices of Young Progressive Beings, a group of pro-choice activists. That protest you heard there was from a couple of months ago when they stood outside Parliament. A Maltese woman had been in hospital with an ectopic pregnancy. Malta's blanket ban on abortion doesn't allow a doctor to immediately administer methotrexate, the treatment that would end the pregnancy. So they needed authorisation, and the woman said she waited 2.5 days for the medicine to be approved. This is Emily Gallia.
Basically, our work mostly involves speaking to people on the street, well, COVID allowing now, but doing stunts, sitting outside law courts or parliament. So my name is Sam. I'm a member of Young Progressive Beings, and I'm also a journalist with Loving Malta.
How much is society and school as well influenced by the Catholic Church, in your view? Help me paint a picture of what it's like.
Hi, my name is Rachel de Guara. Maybe I can take this question. In Malta, our religion is mainly Roman Catholic, but right now a lot of people are cafeteria Catholics. So when it comes to certain principles, they talk very strongly about them, but at the end of the day, unless the problem concerns them directly, their argument most of the times is highly flawed, obviously, because most of the time there isn't the scientific backing behind it. I am myself a practicing Roman Catholic, and I am also a pro-choice activist, because I believe that as a Roman Catholic, every individual must follow his or her own conscience. So that is my stance, even when it comes to the pro-abortion and the pro-choice movement.
Young Progressive Beings, however, aren't the only pro-choice group to emerge in recent years. In 2019, a small group of doctors on the island set up Doctors for Choice.
My name is Professor Isabel Stabile. I'm a gynecologist. I am one of the founder members of Doctors for Choice, originally set up to look at ways in which we could change the abortion legislation in Malta, including things like improving sexual education, improving accessibility to contraception, decriminalizing abortion, which is currently completely illegal on the island, and of course, hopefully one day changing the law.
Hi, I'm Dr. Elena Saliba. I'm a pediatric trainee. I think in the beginning, for the others, it was pure horror. In the beginning, I had my consultants publicly posting on Facebook that we're not actually doctors, that we should get our license retracted, and I was arguing back with them.
I'm not convinced, that we're actually convincing people. Those who have absolutely fixed ideas will never change their mind. And what we need to deal with here, I think, is the middle ground. The relatively younger people who are not only having abortions, because we know that roughly one woman a day is having an abortion in Malta, but also the ones, their relatives, their friends, their family.
I'm Dr. Natalie Psaila. I'm a specialist in family medicine. As a GP, I see women who were not able to have a choice. So basically women with financial problems, then women who are who end up with mental health problems, teenagers who have to take care of a young child and put a stop to their own lives, and she must sacrifice herself for the child, basically. Sacrifice is a central theme in the Catholic religion. So it's something that keeps persisting through different paths that the woman must take.
I have had colleagues who have changed their mind. Yes, they have become pro-choice. And I have pro-life colleagues who kind of say, oh, well, fine, in case of a fatal fetal anomaly or in case of rape. So I have had people who are coming around. But most importantly, as Dr. Stabila said, is that the younger generation, the students, the medical students, the new doctors, they seem to be all coming to our side at the end of the day.
Even if these doctors do see a change coming, they still form a very small minority on the island. An official declaration of what they called pro-life values was signed by more than 670 doctors in response.
I wish to emphasize this. We are a secular group. We do base our premises, our arguments completely on the humanistic principles.
Dr. Gabriel Alul was one of them and is now the head of public relations for the group, who call themselves Doctors for Life.
As a group, we are also very heterogeneous. So yes, there are doctors, including myself, who uphold the Catholic faith and who conform with Catholic beliefs. But when discussing these matters, we never rely on Catholic principles to make our arguments heard, simply because as professionals we believe that faith shouldn't be part of the discussion when it is more of a scientific, of a rational nature. And with regards to the pro-life stance, although there is still obviously a Catholic element to the arguments being sought and being voiced, I do find that many people are also speaking from a point of empathy, maybe because they've seen people who carried on with their pregnancy despite being a crisis pregnancy and who now cherish their decision despite the difficulties which they faced. We also have quite a very strong voluntary sector, and which does great work with people who have disability, who may have intellectual impairment and so on. And people who see these things, see these realities, see these children grow into adults who have a good quality of life despite their limitations, they are less inclined to accept any pro-abortion stance which may limit the chances of livelihood for those whose fetal stage indicates a developmental abnormality, for example, or something of the sort. So I do believe that although there is a huge impact from the Catholic tradition here in Malta, we're also very much in line with changing our laws according to the empathy which we show towards one another as a close-knit community.
While Dr. Elul speaks of Malta as a close-knit community that supports crisis pregnancies, the community within that, which is pro-choice, has a different story. The Abortion Support Network, a UK-based charity, has seen the number of requests for abortion advice from Maltese women increase over the coronavirus pandemic. And Doctors for Choice also say that while flights were grounded, over 150 packs of abortive pills were delivered into Malta.
In fact, the pandemic, globally speaking here, has revealed a whole new reality, and it was a surprise, a shock for many, and obviously it has led to social implications like the one you're quoting here. I do understand that Doctors for Choice did their own exercise. I am not sure how it was done and the validity of their statistics. Obviously, it is concerning simply because it may imply a degradation of the respect for human life, and also a sense of desperation for the women seeking to decide on the prospect of carrying the pregnancy or not. And I think that is why an open discussion about these things, sexual education, contraceptive methods, these things will make it much easier for people to speak up about these issues. So if there were women who engaged in sexual activity during the pandemic and then ended up with an unwanted pregnancy, wouldn't it have been better if they were empowered enough to use contraceptive methods to prevent that pregnancy from occurring in the first place? So our argument shouldn't be one of condemnation, but one of promoting empowerment, promoting women and men to become more attuned to how they could be sexually active without actually becoming embroiled into these sort of problems where they have to procure methods and so on.
Being empowered to use contraceptive methods like Dr. Elul says, however, isn't always achievable in Malta. And that too is something that's influenced by the country's Catholic identity. Here's Professor Isabel Stabile again.
Something else that's happening on the island at the moment, and that is another little, shall we call it, battle that we're trying to win, not quite yet, and that is with the availability of the morning after pill, because as you know, it is now legal on the island. It has been for about 4 or 5 years. However, there are pharmacies and pharmacists that will not stock it and will not dispense it, because they are conscientious objectors. And what this basically means is that it is quite possible that of a Sunday, from 12 noon Sunday, there are no pharmacies open. The only pharmacy available is the emergency pharmacy at the main hospital, which does not stock the morning after pill. The reality, however, is that if we want to prevent abortion, which of course we all would like to do, so the reality is that we have a situation where on the one hand we are pro-life and anti-abortion, anti-choice, and on the other hand, if someone has their back against the wall and they need the morning after pill, and they happen on a Sunday to go to the few pharmacies that are open on the island that will not give you the morning after pill, then you are stuck until the following day, which might be too late. That is, again, to my mind, is ludicrous.
While there are advocacy groups like Young Progressive Beings and Doctors for Choice emerging, that's ultimately all they can do. Give advice and advocate. It's the people in charge of policy who might actually change the law. But do any politicians want to see Malta's law changed?
In reality, both parties, both the Nationalist Party and also my party, the Labour Party, are still both against abortion, and also quite staunchly. So
That's Nikita Zamit-Alamango, who leads the women's movement in the Partit Laborista, Malta's Labour Party.
I've been involved in politics and active for about 13 years now, since I was 17 or 18. I've always wanted to try to, be the change that I want to see. And I've always been vociferous about certain civil rights, like I campaigned for the introduction of divorce in 2011. I think that was one of the major campaigns I did back then. And eventually it was about changing IVF legislation, for instance, civil rights, gay rights, gay adopting rights, and eventually it was morning after pill. Obviously, I am religious myself. I've been brought up in a Catholic environment, and I go to church often. I believe in God, but I don't think that my religious beliefs should stop if divorce. So when we argued for the introduction of divorce, for instance, my point of view was always, look, divorce will give an option, a second chance to people, to families, to kids who have been born out of wedlock. Because the reason is that what I believe and what I don't believe, society is still moving forward, society is changing, forms of families are changing.
On that subject of choice in the past 2 years, there has been increasingly vocal activism in the space of pro-choice regarding abortion. What are your own views on the current state of abortion in Malta? Would you like to change them? Do they form part of your politics?
Well, abortion is a very delicate subject. I don't think it's a simple yes or no matter. I think that no matter what we decide or what I think on a personal level, I think it should be discussed. I think the fact that we're trying to, push this issue under the carpet and not talk about it, ignore it, is, just making it more of a taboo. And we are also being out of touch with reality because, women are still getting abortion. They travel, they go abroad. Even what I'm discussing here, we had our deputy leader who spoke on a similar lines. We've had our MEPs, Dr. Alfred Sant and also Cyrus Enger, who have spoken on similar lines like me. But we have an MP, Rosian Kotar, who has spoken about pro-choice as well. But other than that, everyone is very, very careful about, expressing views, because at the end of the day, we know that the country is what it is. And we do believe in life. It's not an issue about, being... we're not discussing life. We're just discussing, look, we need to discuss this subject. We need to come up with maybe a law which is unique for our country, for example. But I don't think that exporting the problem is the answer, that's all.
Not all politicians agree that the law needs changing whatsoever, nor do they adopt Nikita's view that their politics should not be impacted by their religion. Tonio Fenech was a Minister of Finance for the Nationalist Party from 2008 to 2013. Now he's part of Catholic Voices Malta.
I was part of a party which was coming from the centre-right perspective in terms of also the perspective of the social teachings of the Church as being part also of what inspires our own policies. So as a Catholic, I was also very interested in the social teachings of the Church. And yes, I try to apply those principles.
But Tonio is no longer in Parliament. For him, the battleground is increasingly in the online world, where groups like Young Progressive Beings and Doctors for Choice work hard to spread their message about the value of a woman's life. I'm
sure that a big element of that, unfortunately, is the huge impact that today's social media has on society, and therefore that less and less, the reality is that less and less of the values that usually are given from parents to their children and society at large are being washed away and overwhelmed by the messages being received through the social media. We do also try to engage in social media, so we have our Facebook page and we have our website and that sort of thing. Economics, if I had to put it that way. And an algorithm is behind Facebook, an algorithm is behind Twitter. It's not easy that your message is actually put on their page or on their thread line for them to read it. So we noticed that unfortunately the reach, sometimes you throw something very simple and it reaches 20,000-30,000 people, which for us would be very good, and then you throw another message and you see that only a couple of thousands have been reached, and you realize therefore that you're not really coming there. There's a lot of efforts being done also through education and schools on the issue. So there are outreaches happening which are being very fruitful, which are catching the even younger generation, so from 13, 14, 15, so hopefully we may see a change of trend in the future. But yes, there is a generation which I think we've missed at this point, and it will not be easy to necessarily meet that generation, to be able to speak to her, because obviously once people go into their working life, then you don't have the structured institutions where you can work through, like schools, universities and this sort of thing.
In the course of making this documentary, Francesca put me in touch with a Maltese woman who, after several rounds of IVF, finally managed to conceive and, after one slightly concerning scan, met with the reality that a lot of prenatal scans aren't available in Malta. That's because, irrelevant of what they would find, the law means the mother would still have to deliver the baby. Eventually, the woman went abroad for a scan with her partner, where they were told that their daughter was missing half her face, multiple limbs, would lose more as she grew in utero, and would die of sepsis, which would endanger the mother. At this point, she was 27 weeks pregnant. I still remember the doctor being very caring in his approach as he scanned my belly, but the question, "Why have you waited this long to come see me?" still resounds in my head, she says. I'm going to read you what she's written to me now. Her birth remains one of the most painful and yet beautiful moments of my life. We held her, took pictures with her, and spent the time we felt we needed to bond and make memories with her in that hospital room. However, it was incredibly painful not to be able to go through this with family and friends by our side, and for our families not to have had the opportunity to have met her or held her. She deserved that. We deserve that. But religion and a blanket ban on abortion meant that we went through what no parent should have to go through, all alone, miles away from home, and paid close to €5,000 to be able to protect our little girl and to end her suffering. We still hold a lot of pain and anger and feel that religion really impacted our experience with our daughter. If abortion was an option in Malta, my husband and I genuinely feel that the degree of her anomalies would have been picked up sooner. Even now, religion still impacts our experience. On some level, we live a lie as we tell most people that our daughter was born asleep. We tell this story not because we are ashamed of our decision to end our daughter's suffering and to protect my life. We tell this version as we fear telling the true story may ruin her legacy. It's very important to us that people remember her for the very much loved and wanted baby that she was. We fear that, given the context here in Malta, adding termination to the story would detract from this and our right to mourn, love and miss her in the ways that we do would be taken away from us.
I think it's because everybody knows everybody, and there's been such a stigma and shaming of women who have had abortion. So we've never had a woman openly say, "I am Maltese, I have had an abortion." Not one of the hundreds and hundreds that have abortions every year. Not one, because of the shame and the stigma. Everybody knows, and if you're going to be considered a murderer, who wants to be stoned, and say this? So, it's a very, very difficult subject, and I think this is why it has taken so long and to break the taboo, and still it hasn't been broken totally. It's much better, but because we're such a small society, it's very, very difficult. But, some people don't even realize that, their own daughter or their own sister has had an abortion, and they're out there anti-choice, anti-abortion. So it's that secretive. Society is very, very secretive.
You've been listening to Malta, the island where abortion is a crime, from Heart and Soul on the BBC World Service. Produced and presented by me, Sophia Smith-Gaylor.
This is the BBC World Service, looking at climate change.
The climate study endorsed by 11,000 scientists warns there'll be
How do we deal with the challenge of climate change?
Each week, we'll talk to our journalists on the ground and hear how the crisis is unfolding before their eyes.
And we'll be bringing together leading experts to hear how we might make a better future.
Join Neil Rozelle and Greer Jackson for The Climate Question, Monday at 9:20 GMT. And in an hour, on this week's inquiry...
Our mountains of waste just keep growing. Recycling was supposed to be the answer, but much of the world's waste was shipped abroad for processing. Now it's being rejected and sent back. I'm Charmaine Cozier, and we're asking, is recycling broken?
That's in an hour, here on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
At 11 hours GMT, this is the newsroom from the BBC World Service. I'm Gareth Barlow. Coming up in the next half hour, search teams in Indonesia continue to scour for the wreckage of a crashed Boeing airliner.
We will do our best to find and save the victims, and together let's pray that they can be found. We would like to express our condolences for what has happened.
The president won't go, but Mike Pence will. The vice president says he'll attend Joe Biden's inauguration. In Afghanistan, yet another official is assassinated, despite government and Taliban peace talks. It's election day in Kyrgyzstan, with voters choosing a new president and political system. And
they're solitary, they're nocturnal, they're extremely quiet, bewitching, harmless creatures. No real natural enemies, and now man is their absolute downfall.
We'll hear about the pangolin, the world's most trafficked animal, and the undercover police operations trying to save it.
BBC News. Hello, I'm Jerry Smith. The authorities in Indonesia say they found the black box recorders from a passenger jet that crashed into the sea near Jakarta on Saturday. 62 people were on board. Here's Jonathan Head.
A small flotilla of ships has been combing the surface of the sea in the area where Flight SJ182 vanished just 4 minutes into its journey from the Indonesian capital Jakarta to the city of Pontianak. Pieces of wreckage, clearly identifiable as parts of an aircraft, have been retrieved, and the authorities say they have detected signals which they believe show the location of the missing plane's flight recorders. The sea in this part of Indonesia is relatively shallow, and the weather has now improved, making it more likely that significant parts of the fuselage can be recovered. The police say that some human remains have also been found.
Two landslides several hours apart in the same place in Indonesia have left at least 11 people dead and perhaps dozens more missing. The first landslide on Saturday afternoon was triggered by torrential rain. The second happened in the evening as rescue workers searched for victims of the first disaster. At least 15 people have been killed in violence across Afghanistan as peace talks between the government and the Taliban resume in Qatar. Local officials say that 12 civilians died in an overnight airstrike in Nimruz province that was meant to target Taliban fighters. Sikandar Kamani reports.
The airstrike targeted Taliban fighters, but according to local political leaders, many civilians were killed. Violence has been continuing in Afghanistan despite ongoing peace talks. This morning in Kabul, the spokesman for one branch of the country's security forces was killed in a targeted attack. Last night, Taliban and Afghan negotiating teams began their second round of discussions in Qatar. So far, progress has been slow. It took the two sides nearly 3 months to resolve preliminary issues. Now they're trying to establish an agenda for the talks.
People in Kyrgyzstan are going to the polls to elect a new president and vote in a referendum on how they're governed. The polls are being held 3 months after mass unrest in the country. Abdu Jalil Abdurasulov is in a polling station in the capital, Bishkek.
There are tables set up around the hall where election officials are sitting. There are 18 names on the ballots. One of them, a former MP, Sadir Japarov, is considered to be a likely winner. Just 3 months ago, he was serving a lengthy prison sentence for hostage-taking, and he was freed by his supporters during the mass unrest in October. The voters that I spoke to are saying that what really matters for them is stability in the country. They want to end the political crisis.
You're listening to World News, coming to you from the BBC. Police in Kazakhstan's biggest city, Almaty, have arrested at least 30 people for staging a protest during parliamentary elections that the main opposition party is boycotting. Mobile phone signals in the central square have been turned off. It's the first election since President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev took over from Nursultan Nazarbayev, who led the country for 2 decades. Mr. Nazarbayev still chairs the ruling Radiant Fatherland Party. The US Vice President Mike Pence has appeared to distance himself further from Donald Trump by planning to attend Joe Biden's inauguration. Mr. Trump says he won't be at the ceremony, which takes place in 10 days' time. Mr. Pence had already defied the president by refusing to block confirmation of Mr. Biden's election victory. President Trump is also facing the prospect of being impeached for a second time. Taiwan has welcomed the decision by the United States to lift long-standing restrictions affecting official contacts. The US State Department said the measures had been imposed decades ago to appease Communist China, which claims the territory are now null and void. The change in US policy in the final days of the Trump administration seems bound to infuriate Beijing. But Mark Ho from the governing pro-independence DPP said he wasn't concerned.
China is always the same. I think this year they're probably gonna keep yelling at us, yelling at Taiwan. But I think right now during the pandemic issue, I don't think it's a good timing to overreact.
A group of spectators have been thrown out of a cricket match between Australia and India for racially abusing an Indian player. The game in Sydney was briefly interrupted after the bowler complained to the umpires. The police then escorted the small group of fans out. There was applause, but also some boos. BBC News.
You're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Gareth Barlow. A pitiful collection of scraps spread out on a bright orange tarpaulin could help unlock the mystery of why an Indonesian airliner plummeted 3,000 metres from the sky in a matter of seconds, shortly after taking off from Jakarta yesterday. Shards of fuselage, a shredded life jacket, just some of the objects plucked from the water by search teams. Today, though, success of a kind. The discovery of the flight recorders that could hold the key to understanding the cause of the disaster. The Indonesian President Joko Widodo said the authorities are doing their best to find the remains of the 62 people, including 7 children and 3 babies, who were on board the Boeing 737.
We will do our best to find and save the victims, and together let's pray that they can be found. In the name of the government and Indonesian people, we would like to express our condolences for what has happened.
A spokesman for the plane's owners, the budget carrier Sriwijaya Air, said there had been no problems with the aircraft.
Based on the information I have, the plane was in a good condition when it was flown from Pontianak, Pangkal Pinang, and this was the second route back to Pontianak. There shouldn't have been any problem, and the maintenance report was also fine.
Our correspondent in the region is Jonathan Head, and he brought us up to date on the latest developments.
The search teams resumed this morning. They've been going all day and bringing back what are clearly pieces of this plane. I've seen them holding a main landing wheel, clearly from that model, from a Boeing 737, and pieces of fuselage in the airline's colours. So we know for sure, there's no doubt, the plane went down. The flight tracking app, Flight Radar, recorded the plane falling from 3,000 metres down to the sea in just 20 seconds, so we know it literally fell out of the sky. What we don't know and won't know for a long time yet is exactly what happened. The search teams knew pretty much exactly where the plane went down. It was so soon into its flight, it's not far from the airport. The sea's quite shallow there as well, it's only 20 to 25 metres deep. So all of that makes it very feasible for them to find and recover the wreckage relatively quickly. And obviously after that, they will have to answer the question as to whether something happened, there was a structural failure, something else happened to the plane, whether the pilots did something or whether there was some outside agency, the possibility of an attack. All of those will have to be considered in the investigation, and I imagine it will take some time before we get those answers.
This poses a yet more difficult and saddening questions, though, doesn't it, for Indonesia's airline industry as a whole? It doesn't have the best of safety records.
No, it doesn't. And although they've improved their safety procedures in the last 2 to 3 years, and that's enabled, for example, the European Union to end its ban on Indonesian airlines that it imposed 13 years ago, although it was a moot point as most Indonesian airlines don't fly to Europe. I mean, there were improvements, but this is a very large country, very rough weather, rough terrain, basic airports. I mean, I remember I've flown in and out of the airports many times myself. I mean, some of them are little more than just strips cut out of the ground. And in the last 20 years, there's been a massive expansion of airlines in order to enable 300 million Indonesians to move around 17,000 islands spread across 3,000 kilometres more easily. And that's a big positive for people, following the low-cost carrier model. The downside has been overstretching Indonesia's safety infrastructure that was weak anyway, and overstretching in particular, I think, the ability to get well-qualified and experienced pilots. Although in this case, both pilots in this plane appear to be very experienced and have had a lot of flying hours. But those questions about safety were raised by a series of accidents over the last 2 decades, and they haven't been fully answered yet. And we'll have to see whether whatever happened to this flight has a bearing on those existing flaws in the safety systems.
Jonathan Head, and there's plenty more information on our website, bbc.com/news. To Afghanistan now, and while peace talks between the government and the Taliban resume in Qatar, the violence on the ground continues. At least 15 people have been killed in a series of incidents across the country. Among them, a spokesman for the Public Protection Force who was targeted along with 2 others when their convoy was attacked in the capital, Kabul. I got more details from our correspondent, Secunda Kamani.
Zia Wadan was a spokesman for the Public Protection Force. It's one of the branches of the security forces in Afghanistan, providing security to international organizations in the country. He and 2 colleagues were killed when, according to reports, a magnetic bomb was attached to the vehicle they were traveling in this morning. And that's been a common method of assassination that we've seen used not just against members of the security forces or pro-government figures, but also members of civil society, journalists as well. And it's part of a new and very worrying trend in Afghanistan of these increased targeted attacks, many of which go unclaimed by any militant group. But Afghan officials believe that the vast majority of them are perpetrated by the Taliban, although the Taliban have at times denied involvement in some of those attacks.
And with this latest incident, the Afghan President Ashraf Ghani has again blamed the Taliban. Both sides are committed to peace talks in Qatar, but how on earth can peace be achieved if government officials, journalists and human rights activists are being assassinated?
Yes, absolutely. There is this real disconnect between the fairly slow-moving talks that we've seen in Doha with the second round of discussions between the 2 sides resuming just last night, really, and events in Afghanistan on the ground where the bloodshed has been continuing. I mean, when you speak to many Afghans, there is still, amongst some, a degree of hope that these talks could eventually lead to a settlement, partly because in the last few decades there's really been very little progress at all in terms of any kind of peace talk. So at least now the 2 sides are sitting across the table from each other. But this continued violence in Afghanistan is certainly making many disillusioned with the prospect. And there's a great deal of frustration that the talks have yet to produce any real difference for the lives of ordinary people who are still suffering in this horrific conflict.
And we should note that this isn't just one-sided, because the government has said that as a result of one of their airstrikes, around a dozen civilians have been killed, whilst the government was trying to target Taliban fighters.
Yes, that's right. We've had reports from Nimroz province in the southwest of Afghanistan that, as you say, around a dozen civilians were killed in an airstrike launched presumably by government forces, possibly by international forces, but most likely, I think, by the Afghan Air Force. According to local officials in the area, around a dozen civilians, including women and children, were amongst the dead. And it just goes to highlight really how in this conflict it's ordinary people who are caught in the middle so often and so tragically.
Secunda Kamani reporting. It seems the American president and his deputy have rather different ideas when it comes to Joe Biden's inauguration in Washington in just 10 days' time. While Donald Trump has said he'll give the occasion a miss, Mike Pence has indicated he will be there. Our North America correspondent, Peter Bowes, reports.
For the past 4 years, Mike Pence has been a stony-faced and intensely loyal supporter of the president. But when Mr. Trump suggested the vice president use his position in the Senate to somehow overturn the result of the election, Mr. Pence stood his ground and refused. Since then, the president has reportedly given his deputy the silent treatment. Mr. Trump has said he won't be attending Joe Biden's inauguration ceremony, but after receiving an invitation from the president-elect, Mike Pence has indicated that he will be there. The authorities have made more than 80 arrests following Wednesday's violence, when armed supporters of Mr. Trump rampaged through the Capitol building. Tomorrow in the House of Representatives, Democrats say they'll begin impeachment proceedings for a second time against Mr. Trump. They claim, through his words, that the president gravely endangered the security of the United States and that a vote could take place later in the week.
Peter Bowes reporting. You're listening to the BBC World Service, and Jerry has the headlines.
Indonesian officials say they've located the black box flight recorders of a Boeing 737 which crashed into the sea on Saturday. There's been another targeted bomb attack in the Afghan capital Kabul as peace talks resume between the government and the Taliban. And voters in Kyrgyzstan are choosing a new president and system of government.
Yes, the polls are being held just 3 months after mass unrest in Kyrgyzstan led to the release from jail of the frontrunner in the presidential race, Sadir Japarov. These people in the streets of the capital Bishkek gave their opinions on Mr. Japarov.
I hope that if we choose Sadir, there'll be some improvement. Sadir roots for the people. He wants to fight corruption, promises to elevate Kyrgyzstan, develop the country.
Sadir Japarov uses his position and status to plunge the people into chaos. It shouldn't be like this. He does not take the people into account. He did not even attend the debates.
As well as the presidential ballot, voters will also be asked in a referendum to choose how they are governed, either via presidential or parliamentary systems, or neither. I spoke to Almaz Choroyev from BBC Kyrgyz service in Bishkek.
The mood is relatively calm. The polling stations opened at 8 a.m. local time. However, voters did not flood into the polling stations. So at 2 p.m. local time, the Election Commission announced that just 18.5% of voters participated in the election. So in comparison, during the October parliamentary elections, at this time, 28.1% citizens had casted their vote.
18.5% halfway through the day seems very low. What does this say to us about people's mood towards politics in general in Kyrgyzstan?
In general, Kyrgyzstan is very much politicized society. However, after the October events, the mass riots and the change of power between politicians, I think the citizens want the leaders to focus on the economy rather than potential candidates have also asked other candidates to focus on the economy. There's a danger that the Kyrgyz government might face a default in the near future. We don't know whether by February even the government will be able to pay the pension and the salary of government workers. So the economic situation is dire, and it looks like the citizens sort of want the politicians to focus on the economy rather than the politics.
And voters have 17 candidates to choose from, but the front-runner, Sadir Japarov, has had quite the turnaround in recent months from being in prison to being the favourite.
Yes, he's considered to be the favorite to win. He was released from prison during the October mass unrest following the parliamentary election that were condemned as rigged. So Japarov was sentenced to 11 and a half years in prison for hostage-taking and attempt to take power by force back in 2013. So after protesters seized government buildings, the former president, Jeenbekov, announced his resignation, and Sadir Japarov became the acting prime minister and the president days after the followers released him from prison. So Sadir Japarov's journey from prison to presidential frontrunner in a matter of months is actually a great example of political turmoil in the small Central Asian state.
The BBC's Almaz Choroyev. Long a minnow in the international sea of states dominated by mainland China, Taiwan has welcomed the outgoing Trump administration's announcement that it's to lift long-standing US restrictions on official contacts with the authorities in Taipei. It's a welcome that will, though, be tempered by a healthy dose of realism. The change comes just days before Joe Biden takes over as US president. Mark Ho is from Taiwan's ruling pro-independence DPP party.
I don't think this gesture will have any a huge impact in the short run. But in the long run, I think Taiwan and US, we have mutual interest and we have the same value. After all, I think in every country, their foreign policy, it's not going to change at one click.
Let's get more on this from our Asia-Pacific regional editor, Michael Bristow. Michael, we just heard there from Mark Ho, a rather muted response. What will this mean in real terms for Taiwan?
Well, in some respects, it might mean not a lot because President Trump has just 10 days left in office. Afterwards, his successor, Joe Biden, might completely change this diplomatic approach. But it is important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's significant symbolically. It shows a growing trend in America of favoritism and support for Taiwan and suspicion towards China. And it also puts Joe Biden in a very difficult diplomatic position. He perhaps won't want to take office and immediately go back on what President Trump has done, because it might make him look weak towards people in America who have suspicions about China. It might also look weak towards the leaders in Beijing. What he might do is continue this delicate diplomatic dance that the Americans have set in train over the last few decades as relates to Taiwan. He might not renege on this agreement, but just not act on it either.
Michael, if I was a betting man, and I'm really not, I would though bet that this isn't going to go down very well with the authorities in Beijing. Surely.
Oh, that's exactly the case. They haven't responded yet. There's been a few comments in state-run media which have been quite angry, but certainly they will be furious about this, and there will be a comment at some point in the next few hours, if not coming days. To just remind listeners, there's no bigger issue for Chinese leaders than Taiwan. It might seem a small peripheral issue, but they essentially believe Taiwan is part of its territory and it wants to isolate the islands diplomatically. It doesn't want any country, particularly the United States, forging any stronger diplomatic ties with the islands. So they'll be absolutely furious.
The BBC's Michael Bristow. For now, thank you. In Sweden, a new coronavirus law has come into force, giving ministers the power to close venues including shops, gyms and cinemas. But the government won't be able to set a limit on the number of people who can meet in private homes. The measures were approved by Parliament in Stockholm on Friday, after politicians were called back early from their Christmas break. Maddie Savage reports from the Swedish capital.
Since the start of the pandemic, Sweden's taken a different approach to the rest of Europe, with a focus on voluntary guidelines designed to last months, not weeks, rather than going in and out of lockdown. But this new law allows the government to introduce much stricter measures, as the country battles with some of the highest coronavirus infection rates in the EU. Ministers have already announced a ban of more than 8 people at bookable private party venues, from dining halls to common rooms in apartment blocks. And they've said numbers should be limited in gyms and shops in relation to how big they are, making sure there's at least 10 square metres available per person. Local authorities will have the power to fine businesses that don't follow the rules or force them to close.
From Sweden to Cuba now, where the government says it's reached a deal with Iran to work together on a coronavirus vaccine. Cuba's most advanced vaccine is about to begin the third and final phase of tests. The Iranian government hailed the deal as a strategic alliance. Leonardo Rocha reports.
The Cuban government says it will share information on its most advanced vaccine, the Soberana 02, which is due to enter the third and final phase of testing. Health authorities in Havana say tens of thousands of people in both countries will take part. Cuba and Iran are both suffering the economic and diplomatic impact of international sanctions. If the Cuban vaccine works, they will save millions of dollars and will have control over the production and the distribution of the doses they need.
And you can get plenty more on the daily situation regarding the pandemic via our podcast, The Coronavirus Global Update. All the information you need to know when you need to know it. Search Coronavirus Global Update. Now, Jerry has some more stories from our news desk.
Human rights activists have urged Iraq's Prime Minister to take charge of the volatile security situation in the southern province of Thirkar, following a series of assassinations and kidnappings. The province and its main city, Nasiriyah, have been at the heart of long-running pro-democracy demonstrations. The Spanish government says it will send convoys carrying the COVID-19 vaccine and food supplies to areas cut off by Storm Filomena, which brought the heaviest snowfall in decades. 4 people have died, and in the region of Madrid, rescuers reached 1,500 people trapped in cars. The Spanish Transport Minister, José Luis Baloz, said the weather conditions were unprecedented.
We're amidst the worst snowstorm that has hit much of the country since records began. In some places like Madrid, we've seen the biggest snowfall in recent decades. This is an absolutely exceptional situation that has exceeded even the most pessimistic forecasts.
A group of spectators have been thrown out of a cricket match between Australia and India for racially abusing an Indian player. Police officers escorted them out after an Indian bowler complained to match officials. The Australian cricket authorities condemned the abuse and apologised to the Indian team. Justin Langer is the Australian coach.
It's one of my greatest pet hates in life that people think they can come to a sporting event, whether it's cricket or any code, and pay their money and think they can abuse or say whatever they like. I mean, I've hated it as a player. I hate it as a coach. We've seen it in different parts of the world, and it's really sad to see it happen in Australia.
When the pandemic was in its early stages, one of the theories regarding its origin involved the highly endangered pangolin. The tough scales which cover the prehistoric creatures are sought after for use in Chinese medicine, and that demand has led them to becoming what many people believe are the most endangered and trafficked mammal in the world. Our Africa correspondent Andrew Harding reports on the efforts to tackle the illegal trade in South Africa.
Get down, get down, get down. A sting operation by South African police.
They gave us a bit of a run around, Jock. Went down big time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 arrested.
Inside the car, still alive, a strange and precious victim is rescued. Whose animal is that? A pangolin, one of the world's most endangered, most trafficked creatures. Picture an armoured anteater with thick, hard scales and the ability to roll into a perfect defensive ball. Keep quiet, it's fine. It's highly prized in traditional Chinese medicine, but on no scientific basis.
This is the worst one we've seen. This is the worst male. I'll take blood. He's also very, very thin. He's emaciated.
Injured and weak, the elderly male is rushed to a dedicated pangolin clinic in Johannesburg.
His prognosis is very poor.
But too late to be saved by the vet, Corinne Lawrence.
Unfortunately, when they've been in the trade so long, their immune system is compromised, so healing takes a lot longer, and they get the worst infections. And the suffering that he went through just for some stupid scale, but there's nothing. There's no medicinal value.
This is an acutely sensitive and ancient species. Few survive, an ordeal that resembles a kidnapping, complete with proof of life videos, sent by poachers to potential buyers, or in this case to undercover police. Yeah, come, sir. Please, sir, please. No, sorry, you are part and parcel, huh? No, I can understand. 6 suspects are taken into custody, a sign that South Africa is trying to clamp down on a criminal industry that's come close to wiping out its pangolin population.
Once you've been in the presence of a pangolin, it's almost spiritual. And they're the most sought after.
Conservationist Ray Jansen has been involved in many sting operations.
They've got no real movable jaws, they've got no teeth, they've got a tongue almost as long as their bodies. They're solitary, they're nocturnal, they're extremely quiet, they're territorial, bewitching, harmless creatures, and they've got no real natural enemies, and now man is their absolute downfall.
Just watching a young adult female pangolin heading off into the bushes now. She's been brought out to a safe, protected area in the countryside to feed, sniffing the ground, looking for ants, looking for ant eggs. This female was rescued and survived. Now she's well guarded at a secret location. But the species has gained new prominence after scientists began investigating possible links between pangolins and COVID-19. So there is some evidence from China that pangolins may have played a role in incubating and then transmitting COVID-19 to humans who've eaten the animals. There's also evidence that their immune systems may help us better understand the virus itself.
That report by the BBC's Andrew Harding. You've been listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Gareth Barlow. Reminder of our top story. Indonesian officials say they've located the black box flight recorders of the Boeing 737, which crashed yesterday.
Dark days have come for us all. And when things are bleak, it's hard to stand tall.
I'm feeling so sad. I don't know what to do.
But whenever hard times come to call,
the water on my face and in my shoes helps me remember that this is real, that this is no dream.
Just know that soon brighter days will be here.
You know what? No one can tell me I'm not allowed to talk about this.
Days of hope.
Gentlemen, we have arrived in the promised land.
And days of delight.
It was just pure happiness.
And days when everything just seems right.
You have conducted probably one of the greatest interviews I've ever had.
Let a BBC World Service podcast take you somewhere else.
I feel so emotional.
Search for BBC World Service wherever you get your podcasts.
Doesn't that look beautiful, you guys?
Coming up after the news in My Perfect City on the BBC World Service, our virtual tour of the world's most innovative cities continues. This week we're dropping in on Vienna to find out about its social housing strategy. In the Austrian capital, they believe that housing is a basic human right. New homes are built to the highest design and ecological specification. Many have rooftop gardens and swimming pools. Could it work where you are? That's My Perfect City with me, Fee Glover, Pooja Agrawal and Greg Clark after the news.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. Indonesian search teams have located the black box flight recorders of a passenger plane that crashed into the sea minutes after takeoff from Jakarta. 62 people were on board the Boeing 737. The airline operator, Sriwijaya Air, said the flight's takeoff on Saturday had been delayed because of heavy rain. Landslides have hit Indonesia's West Java province, killing at least 11 people. Dozens more are missing after heavy rain caused mud flows, burying residents in the town of Sumedang. At least 15 people have been killed in Afghanistan as peace talks between the government and the Taliban resume in Qatar. Local officials in Nimruz province say 12 civilians died during an airstrike that intended to target Taliban fighters. In Kabul, a security forces spokesman was killed in a bomb attack. The US Vice President Mike Pence has appeared to distance himself further from Donald Trump by planning to attend Joe Biden's inauguration. Mr. Trump says he won't be at the ceremony, which takes place in 10 days' time. A new law has taken effect in Sweden, giving the government power to close venues such as shops, cinemas and gyms for the first time during the coronavirus pandemic. Sweden is struggling with one of the highest infection rates in the European Union. Police in Kazakhstan's biggest city, Almaty, have arrested at least 30 people for staging a protest during parliamentary elections. The vote is being boycotted by the main opposition party. It's the first election since President Tokayev took over from Nursultan Nazarbayev. And a small group of spectators has been thrown out of a cricket match between Australia and India for racially abusing an Indian player. There was applause, but also some boos when police escorted the fans out of the ground in Sydney. BBC News.
Hello, I'm Fee Glover and you're listening to My Perfect City on the BBC World Service. We're taking inspiration from the world's most innovative cities to create our own urban utopia. Join us on our adventure into the positive. So far in this series, Toronto's employment strategy didn't join our Perfect City portfolio. It is a success story, just not for all its citizens just yet. But we have added Singapore's urban designs for better mental health, and it joins Seoul's smart technology, Medellin's urban regeneration model, Paris's participatory budgeting, and more from the previous series. You can find out all about that on the My Perfect City website. Drop us a line and let us know what you think. You can tweet using the hashtag PerfectCityBBC.
Now, in this episode, we're looking for a city that might have a solution to a growing global crisis. Where is everyone meant to live? Today, we're trying to find a city which has managed to create affordable housing. Joining me are Professor Greg Clark, Global City Advisor, and urban planner Pooja Agrawal, co-founder of Public Practice, a non-profit on a mission to improve the quality and equality of everyday places. So, Pooja, it's an enormous question to start off with, but I know you can do it. How would you sum up the global housing crisis?
That is a big question indeed. It's an economic crisis with rising land prices, especially in cities, with rents rising faster than income. It's a social crisis where there's a chronic shortage of homes for the least advantaged. The impact of COVID-19 on people of colour is not really to do with underlying health issues. Overcrowding in housing, lack of public space, and bad air quality are all key contributing factors, all of which are actually embedded in housing inequality. And finally, it's an environmental crisis, both in terms of high embodied energy required to construct the homes, and also the energy consumptions of homes we live in.
Greg, what kind of solutions are we looking for in our perfect city? I mean, can we solve all of those things that Pooja has outlined?
Well, we can only solve those very big issues with long-term and comprehensive approaches, Fee. And much of what we see around the world is, relatively speaking, quick fixes. That's why our case study today may be interesting. We're looking to expand the range of housing available to all income groups. We're looking to depress price inflation. And we're looking to make sure, as Pooja says, that the quality of the housing, both in terms of what it provides to people as a place to live, but also of its relationship with the environment, is improving. So it's a big task.
Off we go then. Our virtual tour of the world's most forward-thinking cities takes us to self-styled City of Music. It's Vienna. That's right, apart from being the birthplace of the snow globe, the capital of Austria, population nearly 2 million, has been home to more classical composers than any other city in the world. Beethoven, Haydn, Schubert, Strauss 1 and 2 all lived here, as did the father of modern psychology, Sigmund Freud, which earned Vienna its other nickname, the City of Dreams. Vienna is said to have the best social or public housing in the world, an attention-grabbing claim that certainly caught our eye. In Vienna, more than 60% of residents live in social housing, about half owned directly by the city, and the rest by state-subsidised, not-for-profit housing cooperatives. 26-year-old radiographer Malina Navasarchian is one of them. She gave me a virtual tour of her brand-new Vienna apartment.
So this is the kitchen.
That's that's all sparkly new, isn't it? You've got a very nice sitting area as well.
Thank you.
And is it right that you actually had a hand in designing the apartments?
Yes, the construction company hired a social studies group. They invited us and interviewed us what our priorities are. So we got a gym room now, we got a community kitchen you can rent, you have everything in this building, which the neighbors said what they wanted. So, yeah. I can show you the balcony too, just a second.
This is very nice. So doors going out onto a balcony so you can sit out there on a Sunday morning. Oh, look at that. Lovely cityscape, very nice.
Thanks a lot, means a lot to me.
Malina got her apartment in the district she grew up in as part of a scheme to help young people get a place of their own. It's probably a far cry from the first homes of most 26-year-olds around the world. So let's find out how this works. Maria Vasilaku was Vienna's Green Party deputy mayor for 10 years and now runs consultancy firm Vienna Solutions, sharing the city's best practices with the world.
Social housing lies really at the heart of Vienna's identity. Vienna has been the capital of a huge empire at the turn of the century, and back then it was facing an extreme housing crisis. So a mayor and some very inspired people in Vienna decided that they want to change this, and they embarked in social housing, which now amounts to a tradition of a century. In Vienna, we deeply believe that every human being has the right to a decent life. And clearly, being able to afford a decent place to live belongs to life quality. But I think it's more than that. The most important part when it comes to today and the idea of sustainable urban development is that due to unaffordability of housing, young people get pushed out of the city.
And in Vienna, keeping young people like Meline close to the city centre has wider benefits.
I don't pay so much for this flat. The rent isn't that high, so I can go out to the city center and support small businesses, support the restaurants here, and the Viennese people love it. You know, it makes a difference if you spend half of your income on your rent, or me personally, I know that I can save up to a quarter of my income.
Vienna's social housing is mainly financed by a 1% income tax, which everyone in the city who has a job is expected to pay. And this subsidy means that the average rent is just €5 per square metre. To give you an idea how cheap that is compared to other European capitals, Daniele Karatz, a researcher at the University of Vienna, is going to give us some comparisons.
The average net rent in London is 27. In Paris, it is about 20. So that we really speak about a very, very low net rent, but this might entail a very, very high quality.
Quality is ensured because prospective housing developers have to compete for new social housing contracts, and the city's best architects and planners battle it out in a design showdown where only the very highest standards win. Former Vienna Deputy Mayor Maria Vasilarko.
Think of something with high ecological and energetic standards, perhaps with a swimming pool on top, most probably with balconies where you can actually also grow vegetable.
They have parks, they have playgrounds, they have rooftop terraces, they have saunas, so they